Hey guys, tonight we're climbing down into the hold of a pirate ship, not for the gold, not for the cutlasses, but for the smell. Somewhere between the powder kegs and the water casks, there's a goat. Quite possibly a pig. Somewhere above deck, there's a cat who technically outranks half the crew, and somewhere in a barrel of ship's biscuit there are more weevils than there are men aboard. Which, on a crowded sloop, is really saying something. Tonight, we're going through the actual, documented, occasionally absurd animal population of a Golden Age pirate vessel. The livestock that kept men alive, the vermin that nearly killed them anyway. The parrots and monkeys picked up in tropical ports, because it turns out pirates liked company too. And the real castaway whose feral goats and half-tamed cats became one of the best documented survival stories to come out of the whole era. Welcome aboard. Dim the lights if you can, and if there's a fan nearby, let it hum low through rigging, study, a little hollow. You're warm right now. Dry, still, out there. 300 years ago, none of that was ever guaranteed for long. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your name for tonight is Josiah Dunn, and the smell hits you before the ship does. Tar, brine, and something warm and animal drifting up from below decks that you can't quite place yet. You'll place it soon enough. It's manure. Sign the articles, take your berth, and within your first hour aboard, you discover that a pirate sloop is not just a warship. It's a farm. A cramped, rolling, seasick farm, and somewhere below the waterline 4 goats and 2 pigs are already complaining about the accommodations louder than any of the men. This isn't decoration, and it isn't sentiment. It's logistics. Salted meat and dried peas keep a crew alive, technically, but they don't keep a crew healthy. And a ship with no fresh food aboard is a ship slowly poisoning its own men with monotony and scurvy in equal measure. So somebody, probably the quartermaster, since on most Golden Age crews the quartermaster handled provisions and discipline both, has decided that this voyage carries its dinner alive. Here's the thing about that decision. It sounds practical until you're the one mucking out the goat pen in a 4-foot crawl space while the ship pitches. Livestock aboard a wooden sailing vessel needs feed, needs water, the same fresh water the crew is rationing for themselves, and needs somewhere to stand that isn't also where the gunpowder is stored, which narrows the options considerably. The animals get whatever corner nobody else wants. Usually that's near the bow, in the space called the manger, a word that will eventually cross the Atlantic and end up meaning something considerably more wholesome in a stable a few centuries later. Your job, this voyage, is goats. Not glamorous, not the piracy you signed up for, but by the time you've been aboard a week, you'll understand exactly why the ship's articles list an equal share for every man who does unglamorous, necessary work. Because somebody has to, and resentment doesn't fill a stomach. 3 days out from port, and you meet the pigs properly for the first time, which is to say you meet what pigs actually eat. Which is to say, anything. Rotten biscuit, fish heads, the sludge that collects in the bilge, scraps too far gone even for a hungry sailor. This is precisely why pigs earned their berth aboard in the first place. A pig is a garbage disposal that turns into bacon. Goats are pickier and drink less water pound for pound than almost any other domestic animal available to a 17th century sailor, which is the real reason they outnumber every other 4-legged creature on a small vessel, not sentiment, arithmetic. A goat can survive on browse, on scrub, on very little, and still produce milk for an officer's coffee or a sick man's broth. On a ship where fresh water is measured out by the pint and hoarded like coin, an animal that asks for almost nothing is worth more than one that asks for a little. The chickens get the best real estate of the 3. Oddly enough, a coop lashed somewhere on deck where they can catch air and light, because a hen that never sees daylight stops laying. And eggs are currency aboard a ship, where currency mostly means salt pork and rum. You'll spend part of this first week learning to walk past that coop without flinching every time the ship rolls and 11 startled hens announce it to the entire ocean. Here's the part nobody warns you about. None of these animals have names yet, except in your own head. Because naming the thing you're going to eat in 6 weeks is widely understood, without anyone needing to say it aloud, to be a bad idea. You break that rule almost immediately. There is a small brown and white goat who follows you specifically, not the cook, not the quartermaster, you every time you cross the manger, butting gently at your knee for the handful of biscuit crumbs you've started saving without quite admitting to yourself why. You call her Nan, quietly, when nobody's listening. This is, historically, an extremely common failure mode. Sailors on ships all across the age of sail wrote about exactly this. A hardened crew developing a soft spot for the one animal that showed the faintest flicker of personality, and then having to reckon with what that animal was ultimately for. By your second week at sea, the water ration has tightened, and so has the mood below decks. Here's the arithmetic nobody enjoys doing out loud. Every gallon that goes to Nan and her penmates is a gallon that doesn't go to a man on watch in the tropical sun. The quartermaster does this math daily, and on a well-run pirate ship, which, contrary to the popular image of chaos and murder, most successful ones had to be, or they didn't stay afloat long enough to become successful. The math gets discussed openly. This is one of the quieter truths about how pirate crews actually organise themselves. Where a Royal Navy captain could simply order the ration cut and flog anyone who complained, a pirate captain elected by his own crew, bound by written articles the men had voted on themselves, generally had to persuade rather than command when resources ran short. It's not romance, it's structure. It's the same structure that guaranteed a wounded man compensation for a lost eye or a lost leg under most sets of pirate articles that survive in the historical record, a formalised, voted on sense that risk and reward and cost got shared out rather than dumped on whoever couldn't fight back. None of that makes the smell any better. By day 12, the manger smells the way you'd expect 4 goats and 2 pigs living in a wooden box in the tropics to smell, and you've started holding your breath the way you might walk past an open sewer grate back home, except home is 6 weeks and 3,000 miles away, and this grate follows you to bed. 10 days out, and you finally sort out the hens by more than just feathers. There are 11 of them, and within a week they've settled into an order as rigid as anything in the ship's articles. One particular red hen eating first, always, while the others wait their turn without anyone teaching them to. The ship's boy, a wiry 12-year-old everyone calls Tam, because his real name never quite caught on, has appointed himself keeper of the coop, and he knows all 11 hens by sight in a way you privately find more impressive than most of the navigation the sailing master does. Tam counts eggs the way some men count coin. 4 yesterday, 6 today, none at all the day the ship pitched hard enough to send half the coop sliding across the deck. He's the one who told you, matter-of-factly, that a startled hen stops laying for days afterward, which is why the coop gets lashed down tighter than almost anything else aboard before rough weather. Here's the arithmetic Tam's already worked out better than most grown hands. 11 hens producing even 3 or 4 eggs a day is a meaningful supplement to a diet otherwise built on salt pork and biscuit, and eggs don't require killing anything to get them, which makes the coop, in its own small way, the least grim corner of the entire floating farm. You start bringing Tam your own biscuit scraps for the hens, without quite admitting you're doing it for him as much as for them. 12 days out, and one of the pigs stops eating, which is the kind of detail that sounds minor until you understand what it actually means aboard a ship with no veterinary surgeon and no real medicine beyond whatever the ship's surgeon has on hand for men. Cooper crouches by the pen a long while, watching the animals breathing, and finally delivers the verdict in the flat, unsentimental tone of a man who's seen this before. Heat sickness, likely, made worse by the cramped pen and the thick, still air below decks in this latitude. There's no cure available beyond moving the animal somewhere cooler and hoping, and for 2 days the crew actually rearranges cargo to give the sick pig space nearer a hatch where it can catch some air. A genuinely inconvenient favour to do for an animal that's going to end up in a stew, regardless of whether it recovers. You ask Cooper why bother, and he shrugs and says a pig that dies slow of sickness is wasted meat nobody can salvage safely, while a pig that gets better is dinner either way. Which is, you realise, the least sentimental possible explanation for an act that still looks a great deal like mercy from where you're standing. 3 weeks out, and the first slaughter happens. Not Nan, not yet, one of the pigs, chosen because it stopped putting on weight and started eating more than it's worth. The ship's cook, a broad, unhurried man everyone calls Cooper regardless of whether that was ever his actual trade, does the killing quickly and without ceremony. Because ceremony wastes daylight, and daylight is for sailing. The meat gets divided that night in a stew thickened with the last of the dried peas, and you eat better than you have in 3 weeks, and you try very hard not to think about how the eating and the killing are the same event separated by only a few hours. Here's the part that might surprise you. This is, historically, one of the better documented aspects of shipboard life, because provisioning logs, when they survive, are dry, careful, itemised things. Captains and quartermasters tracking exactly how many animals came aboard, how many remained, how many days of meat that represented. It's some of the least romantic paperwork in the historical record, and also some of the most reliable, precisely because nobody was exaggerating a livestock count for glory. 16 days out, and the ship runs down a small Dutch trading sloop that puts up almost no fight at all, and boarding her teaches you something about plunder that none of the songs back home ever mentioned. Alongside the expected cargo, bolts of cloth, a strongbox the quartermaster prize open on the spot, there's livestock aboard her too. 2 goats, a half-dozen more chickens, penned in a space not much better than your own ship's manger. Taking an enemy vessel's animals is standard practice, and nobody aboard treats it as anything but ordinary business, the same as claiming her sailcloth or her spare cordage. What strikes you, watching the transfer happen, is how quickly the distinction between our livestock and their livestock dissolves the moment the animals cross from one deck to the other. Goats don't know whose flag they're penned under, and within an hour the newly claimed animals are simply part of the herd, indistinguishable from the ones that sailed out of port with you. Here's the part that catches in your chest a little. One of the captured goats has a scrap of red ribbon tied loosely around her neck, clearly someone's small private touch back on the Dutch vessel, and nobody bothers to remove it. It stays there for the rest of the voyage. A strange little flag of a life that used to belong to somebody else entirely. By the 4th week, the goats have started eating the ship itself, or trying to, gnawing at coiled rope ends, at the edges of canvas, at anything remotely fibrous. Because a goat's appetite doesn't discriminate between food and cargo. This is a genuine recorded headache across the entire age of sail, not a myth, livestock damaging rigging and sailcloth badly enough that some captains eventually soured on carrying certain animals at all. You spend an increasingly irritated afternoon shooing Nan away from a coil of line she has apparently decided is dinner, and you lose. 20 days out, and the freshwater situation forces the argument you'd been half expecting since week 2. The quartermaster calls the crew together, not a formality reserved for captains alone aboard a ship run on articles, but a genuine discussion because the men who voted this crew's leadership into place are entitled to a say in decisions that touch their own rations. The math is blunt: continue watering the animals at the current rate, and the men's own ration tightens further within the week. Cut the animals back hard, and at least one, probably the weakest of the goats, likely won't survive to the next landfall. It's not a comfortable conversation. A few hands argue for cutting the livestock ration immediately and eating the weak one now, rather than watching it starve slowly for nothing. Others, Tam loudest among them despite being barely old enough to have a vote that counts for much, argue the coop and the goats have more use alive than as one thin, premature meal. The vote, when it happens, splits close, and the decision that wins: trim the ration for both men and animals equally rather than sacrifice one group for the other, tells you something true about how this particular crew actually sees itself. Not officers and livestock and expendable extras, but everyone aboard absorbing the same hard season together, in shares, the way the articles always promised they would. 5 weeks in, a storm hits, and you learn the single worst part of keeping livestock at sea. Animals panic exactly like people do, but they can't be reasoned with, ordered to their stations, or told the ship has weathered worse. The pig squeals loud enough to be heard over the wind. The chickens throw themselves against the coop hard enough to draw blood. Nan, to your genuine surprise, presses herself against your leg in the dark and goes almost perfectly still, and you stand there, bracing both of you against the roll of the ship, and something in your chest does something you're not going to examine too closely. Not tonight. Not with the deck this wet and the wind this loud. The storm passes, as storms do. What happens to Nan, specifically, is a different matter. But that's not yet. 6 weeks out, and the ship makes landfall at a small, mostly uninhabited quay to careen, to haul over on its side in shallow water and scrape the hull clean of the weed and barnacle that slow a ship down badly enough to cost a chase or a getaway. This is also, not coincidentally, when the livestock gets restocked, because islands across the Caribbean, Mona, Tortuga, and later, famously the Juan Fernandez Islands off the Chilean coast, carried substantial feral goat populations by this point in history. Descended from animals deliberately released decades earlier by earlier Spanish and Portuguese sailors as a kind of standing pantry for whoever passed through next. You spend 2 days ashore with a hunting party rounding up replacement stock, and it's grim, sweaty, unglamorous work that never once resembles the swashbuckling the songs describe. It's also, in its own way, generous, a chain of sailors a century apart leaving food behind for strangers they'd never meet, because the sea doesn't care whose flag you fly when you're starving. You think about that vote again a week later, after Nan is gone, and the pen looks different, and Cooper won't meet your eye. Bartholomew, an older hand, grey at the temples, who said maybe 40 words to you the entire voyage, finds you at the rail that evening and, without much preamble, tells you he had a dog once. Years back, on a different ship, before he ever signed pirate articles at all. Some kind of small brown terrier that rode 3 voyages with him and drowned in a storm on the 4th. He doesn't say much else. He doesn't need to. You understand, standing there, that this grief you're carrying over a goat isn't unusual, isn't embarrassing, isn't something the ship expects you to hide. It's just what happens to men who spend months at a stretch with almost nothing soft in their lives, and then find something, however briefly, and lose it the way everything out here eventually gets lost, or spent, or traded on. Bartholomew claps you once on the shoulder, says nothing more, and walks off toward his watch, and somehow that's exactly enough. By the time the ship puts back out to open water, the pen is full again, and Nan is gone, traded off, quietly, by the quartermaster to a passing merchant vessel in exchange for 2 barrels of flour. because a goat that stopped producing milk and started eating rigging is, by the ship's own arithmetic, no longer worth her keep. Nobody tells you outright. You just notice the pen looks different one morning, and Cooper won't quite meet your eye, and that's answer enough. Here's the honest truth of it, the one the ship's articles never write down because they don't need to. On a pirate vessel, almost nothing gets to just be a pet. Every mouth aboard, four-legged or two, earns its keep or gets put ashore, and the line between fondness and food is thinner out here than it would ever be allowed to get back home. You'll think about Nan on and off for the rest of the voyage, the way you might think about a shipmate transferred to another crew. Gone, probably fine, definitely not coming back. The voyage runs another 2 months after that landfall, through 2 more prizes taken and 1 close call with a Spanish guardacosta that has everyone too busy to think about livestock at all. By the time you make port again, the goat pen holds 3 new animals you've deliberately not learned to recognise individually. The chicken coop has molted its way through a rough Atlantic crossing and come out the other side still laying. And you've eaten better, more consistently, than most landsmen your age eating salted rations back home ever manage. That's the trade a floating farm makes possible. It costs water, it costs space, it costs the occasional soft evening you didn't ask for and can't quite shake. And in exchange, it keeps 100 men fed, upright, and fit enough to sail, fight, and go home again with their shares intact. The farm empties out again in port, restocks, and sails on the next voyage exactly the way it always has, which is, in its own quiet, unglamorous way, one of the things that actually kept these ships alive far longer than the legends about them ever bother to mention. Here's a final piece of arithmetic worth carrying forward, because it says something about the whole enterprise more than any single animal's story can. A merchant ship crossing the same ocean under the same flag as a legitimate trading company, provisioned by owners back in London or Amsterdam, who answered to shareholders rather than to a crew's own vote, generally carried less fresh livestock per head than a pirate vessel did. Not more. Legitimate shipping companies watched costs the way any business does, and fresh meat aboard was an expense to be minimised rather than a right to be protected. A pirate crew, answering only to itself and to the articles it had voted into being, tended to spend more of its own hard-won resources on exactly the kind of provisioning that kept ordinary sailors fed and healthy, because the men making that decision were the same men who'd go hungry if they got it wrong. It's a strange, quiet argument buried in the ship's ledgers for the idea that piracy, whatever else it cost the world, sometimes treated its own crews better than legitimate maritime commerce treated its. Nan's pen, Tam's coop, Cooper's careful count of pigs against days at sea. None of it was generosity exactly. But it wasn't nothing, either, that floating farm bought you protein. It did not buy you peace below decks, because for every animal the crew chose to bring aboard, there was another one already waiting there, uninvited, and it didn't answer to anyone's articles at all. Charles Johnson's 1724 General History of the Pirates, the book responsible for most of the pirate imagery still circulating today, and a source scholars treat with real caution given its author's love of a good dramatised scene, never bothers mentioning ships' cats by name. That's telling in its own way. Cats aboard sailing vessels weren't legend, they were infrastructure, and infrastructure rarely makes it into the dramatic parts of the record. Picture the hold of a merchant sloop, sometime in the 1710s, somewhere in the Caribbean, before it's ever been taken by anyone flying a black or red flag. Barrels of ship's biscuit stacked 3 deep, and inside those barrels, a population problem. Weevils, certainly, the small grain beetles whose larvae riddled hardtack so reliably that sailors across the entire age of sail developed a grim standard joke about tapping your biscuit on the table before eating it, just to knock the worst of the live cargo loose first. But behind the weevils, feeding on the weevils and on the biscuit and on anything else soft enough to chew, came rats. Real numbers on shipboard rat populations are hard to pin down precisely. Nobody in 1715 was running a formal census, but surviving accounts from across the era describe infestations bad enough to gnaw through rope, through the caulking between hull planks, and, as one particular castaway is about to demonstrate a few chapters from now, through the toes and ears of a sleeping man if nothing else was available. A rat problem on a wooden ship isn't an inconvenience. It's a structural threat, a disease vector, and a slow theft of the very food the crew is depending on to survive the crossing, which is precisely why, by the time this vessel changes hands and its crew starts flying under new colours, whichever animal was already keeping the rat population in check earns automatic, unquestioned continuity of employment. Pirates, whatever else the popular imagination gets wrong about them, were not in the business of throwing away something that worked. So, the cat stays. This is the quiet, unglamorous truth sitting underneath centuries of pirates and their parrots' imagery. The animal that actually mattered most for a ship's day-to-day survival wasn't perched on anyone's shoulder looking picturesque. It was low to the deck, mostly nocturnal, and treated with something close to reverence by crews who understood, in very concrete terms, exactly what it stood between them and. Here's where the story has to be handled carefully, because this is exactly the kind of claim that tends to calcify into false certainty the longer it gets repeated. Specific, individually named pirate ship cats, a particular animal, aboard a particular named pirate vessel with a documented fate, are vanishingly rare in the surviving record from the Golden Age itself. What we have instead is a much broader, better attested pattern across maritime history generally, naval logs, merchant company records, and later much better documented cases from the 18th and 19th century Royal Navy, all describing cats as a standard, expected, semi-official part of a ship's company. The specific pirate ship anecdotes that do circulate, a particular captain's particular beloved cat, a particular dramatic rescue during a particular battle, mostly trace back to secondary retellings written well after the fact, the same kind of embellishment Charles Johnson's readers were being served in 1724, dressed up as history. Treat those specific stories the way you'd treat a ghost story, entertaining, plausible in outline, not something to bet the facts on. What is solidly documented is the function, even where the individual animal isn't. Ships across the 17th and 18th centuries routinely carried cats specifically for pest control, valued the ones that proved good hunters, and in some documented naval contexts even tracked cats on ships' books alongside the crew. A detail that later became formalised enough that by the following century, Royal Navy ships kept official cat allowances written into supply regulations. A pirate crew, operating outside any formal navy, but still needing every practical advantage a legitimate warship had, would have had every reason to adopt the same practice without needing a regulation to tell them to. There's a second function running alongside the practical one, and this is where superstition enters the picture, genuinely, not as embellishment. Sailors across nearly every maritime culture of the era carried beliefs about cats and luck, and those beliefs cut in contradictory directions depending on who you asked and which port they'd sailed from. A black cat crossing a sailor's path before departure was, in some traditions, a sign of good fortune specifically because it was rare and therefore auspicious. In others, exactly the opposite. A cat that grew suddenly restless before a storm was watched carefully, because sailors, with good reason, given how much time they spent trying to read weather before instruments could do it for them, trusted an animal's instincts over a landsman's guess. Losing a ship's cat overboard was, across multiple documented traditions, considered a genuinely bad omen. Bad enough that some accounts describe crews going to real trouble to fish a cat back out of the water rather than let the loss stand unaddressed. Picture the practical result of all this belief layered on top of function. A cat aboard a pirate vessel occupied a strange, privileged position no other animal on the ship shared. It wasn't livestock, headed inevitably for the pot. It wasn't vermin, to be exterminated on sight. It was closer to crew, fed deliberately, sometimes with better scraps than the men allowed themselves, tolerated in places other animals would have been shooed out of, and, if the more colourful secondary accounts are to be even partially believed, occasionally given something resembling a share of understanding, if not an actual share of the plunder, in the crew's collective affection. Consider the specific mechanics of what a working ship's cat's day actually involved, because it's grimmer and more impressive than the sentimental image suggests. Rats aboard a wooden ship don't confine themselves to daylight hours or convenient locations. They nest in the bilge, in coiled cable, behind cargo, anywhere dark and undisturbed. Which means a cat doing its job properly is working the ship's worst, most cramped, most waterlogged spaces at night, essentially alone. It's dangerous, filthy work by any measure, carried out by an animal nobody trained for it in any formal sense. Cats simply do this instinctively, which is precisely why they were valuable rather than merely decorative. A single effective ship's cat, over the course of a long voyage, could plausibly account for keeping a rat population from tipping over into the kind of infestation that ate through a ship's entire food reserve before landfall. Here's the part that lands with real weight once you sit with it, on a ship where human life was cheap by any modern standard, where a man could be flogged, marooned, or killed in a boarding action without much ceremony. The ship's cat often received a kind of unspoken protection that outranked most of the crew. Nobody voted the cat a share under the articles. Nobody needed to. Its value was self-evident every single night it kept working, and a crew that depended on their food stores lasting the whole crossing understood exactly what they owed it. There's a final layer worth sitting with before this thread closes out. The cat's presence aboard says something quietly revealing about what pirate life actually was, underneath the flag and the reputation. It wasn't chaos for its own sake. It was, structurally, an enterprise obsessively focused on survival and provisioning, run by men who had every reason to value whatever kept them alive longest, whether that was a written contract dividing the risk fairly, or a small animal working alone in the dark, keeping the biscuit barrels a little less full of things that weren't biscuit. Consider, too, how a ship's cat actually behaved during the one kind of event you'd expect to send any sensible animal fleeing below decks entirely: combat. Surviving general accounts of shipboard animals during actual engagements are inconsistent, understandably, since nobody was taking careful notes during a boarding action. But the pattern that does emerge across multiple maritime traditions describes cats retreating to the lowest, most sheltered part of the hold during cannon fire. The same instinct that made them good at hunting rats in exactly those spaces, and then reappearing almost immediately once the noise stopped, apparently undisturbed enough to resume hunting within the hour. There's a practical logic buried in that resilience worth noting. An animal too easily rattled by chaos wouldn't have lasted long, working the deepest, darkest, most cramped parts of a working warship in the first place. Whatever selective pressure shaped which cats made good ships cats and which didn't, steadiness under noise was clearly part of it. There's a health dimension to all this that period sailors wouldn't have understood in modern terms, but plainly recognised in practice. Rats aboard ships across history are well documented as carriers of disease. The connection between shipboard rat populations and outbreaks of illness among crews was observed, if not fully explained, well before germ theory existed to name the mechanism precisely. A crew that kept its rat population meaningfully suppressed wasn't just protecting its food stores, it was, almost certainly without knowing the exact reason, protecting its own health in ways that occasionally meant the difference between a voyage that lost a handful of men to sickness and one that lost considerably more. This is speculative in its precise mechanism for any single documented voyage, since period records rarely connect cat presence directly to health outcomes in so many words. But the broader pattern across maritime history, where ships with poor pest control suffered worse disease outcomes generally, is solid enough to take seriously. Picture 2. The genuinely different superstitions running through different crews depending on where the men themselves came from, because sailors believed cats were lucky flattens, a much messier reality. English maritime tradition of the period leaned toward treating black cats specifically as favourable aboard ship, even while the same colour carried the opposite association ashore, a contradiction sailors seem to have simply lived with rather than resolved. Mediterranean maritime traditions, shaped by centuries of different folklore entirely, carried their own separate sets of beliefs about which animals brought fortune and which brought disaster. And a genuinely international pirate crew, which most Golden Age crews were, drawing hands from English, French, Dutch, and African backgrounds alike, free and formerly enslaved men serving side by side under the same articles, would have carried all of these overlapping, sometimes contradictory beliefs aboard the same deck at once. Rather than one crew's superstition winning out, what more likely happened, across countless real ships never individually documented, was a kind of quiet negotiated truce. Don't disrespect the cat, regardless of which specific tradition you personally hold about why that matters. Here's an illustrative scenario worth walking through carefully, clearly flagged as reconstructed rather than drawn from one specific documented incident, because it captures a pattern described more generally across period accounts. A cat goes overboard during rough handling of cargo, knocked from a rail, caught by a wave breaking over the side. And for a crew that has quietly come to depend on that animal, the reaction is immediate and disproportionate to what losing any other single creature aboard would provoke. Men who wouldn't break stride to save a chicken blown overboard will, according to the broader pattern in the record, go to real trouble and real risk to fish a ship's cat back out of the water, not purely from sentiment, but from the same superstitious weight that made losing one feel like losing a piece of the ship's own luck. Whether the specific cat survives any given telling of this scenario varies. Sometimes it doesn't, and the loss gets logged, in whatever informal way a crew logs such things, as a genuinely bad turn in the voyage's fortune, discussed and worried over for days afterward. Larger vessels, worth noting before this thread closes, sometimes carried more than one cat, not out of excess but out of simple scale. A bigger hold meant more space for rats to hide, and a single cat, however diligent, could only patrol so much darkness in a night. Multiple cat crews appear across various period maritime records, generally without much comment, as though it was simply understood that the size of the pest problem should scale with the size of the solution. Consider what happens when a ship's cat turns out to be pregnant partway through a voyage, because it's a genuinely common complication the record touches on more than you'd expect. A litter born below decks presented a real, if minor, logistical question for a crew already tight on space and rations, more mouths, however small, competing for scraps, in an environment that had already worked out, with some precision, exactly how much slack existed in the food supply. Surviving general accounts from across the age of sail suggest most crews simply tolerated it, treating a litter of kittens the way they might treat any temporary surplus, a few kept aboard to eventually replace an aging or injured working cat. The rest, once old enough to survive without their mother, traded off in port to other ships or to dockside merchants glad of a free ratter. This was, in its own small way. One of the more genuinely cheerful transactions to happen around a pirate ship's business, since, unlike almost every other animal exchange this whole night has covered, nobody involved was thinking primarily about meat. A kitten sold off in port carried none of the grim arithmetic that governed a goat's fate or a turtle's. It was simply insurance. One working ship, somewhere down the coast, a little better protected against its own rats, because this one happened to have a mother willing to work through her pregnancy. Larger prize ships, once a pirate crew had taken one and pressed it into their own service, sometimes revealed just how seriously merchant and naval crews of the era had already taken this whole question before pirates ever got involved. A captured vessel with a deep, well-stocked hold, the kind of ship that had spent months carrying cargo across the Atlantic before ever crossing paths with a pirate crew, often carried its own working cat population already established. Familiar with that specific ship's hiding places and rat runs in a way no newly acquired cat could match on day one. Smart quartermasters, according to the broader pattern in surviving accounts, knew better than to disturb a working arrangement that was already functioning. The cat, in other words, frequently came with the prize, unremarked upon in any formal inventory, and simply kept doing the job it had always done. Now for a considerably rowdier set of employers. There's something almost comic about it, if you sit with the image long enough. A ship changes hands entirely, its flag hauled down and a new one run up in its place, its officers taken prisoner or thrown overboard or pressed into new service, and through all of it, below decks, an animal that never once cared whose colours flew overhead simply keeps hunting the same rats in the same dark corners. It always has. There's something worth sitting with, in the end, about how much quiet trust an entire ship full of hardened, violent, legally condemned men extended to one small animal that never signed any articles, never took any oath, and could, at any point, simply have jumped ship at the next port and never looked back. Some certainly did, but enough stayed. Generation after generation of working ship's cats passed hand to hand and hold to hold across the whole age of sail, that the pattern itself became something close to a quiet act of faith on both sides, a crew betting its food supply and its health on an animal's instincts, and an animal, whatever its actual motivations, choosing to keep hunting in the dark long after any reasonable creature might have decided the arrangement wasn't worth the trouble. Consider, finally, what a working ship's cat actually ate day to day, because rats alone, however plentiful, don't always add up to a complete diet, and crews understood this well enough to supplement it deliberately. Scraps of salt fish, the fatty trimmings off whatever meat Cooper was preparing that evening, occasionally a portion of milk from one of the goats when the ration allowed it, all of it found its way to the ship's cat as a matter of routine rather than special favour, folded into the same daily rhythm of feeding and mucking out that governed every other animal aboard. What set the cat apart wasn't that it ate better than the goats or the pigs, because it often didn't. It was that nobody aboard ever calculated, the way they calculated with Nan, exactly how many more weeks of feeding a particular cat's usefulness would justify. The goat's keep was measured against a slaughter date the whole crew understood was coming. The cat's keep simply continued, voyage after voyage, for as long as the animal kept doing its job, which in practice meant for as long as it lived. That's a meaningfully different kind of belonging than anything else aboard the ship, and it's worth naming plainly rather than letting it blur into the general fondness the crew showed toward Nan or the coop full of hens. The cat's place aboard wasn't sentiment dressed up as usefulness. It was usefulness that happened over enough voyages and enough close, dark, shared nights working the same holds to earn something that looked a great deal like sentiment anyway. There's one more piece of the picture worth including. because it says something about how a crew's superstitions and its practical calculations reinforced each other rather than competing. A captain looking to buy a new cat in port, replacing one lost overboard or grown too old to hunt effectively, didn't simply take whatever animal happened to be available at the dockside. Period accounts describe sailors expressing real preferences, certain coat patterns favoured over others depending on which tradition a given crew leaned toward. A cat's general temperament watched carefully before any coin changed hands, since a nervous or lazy animal would be worse than no cat at all aboard a ship that genuinely depended on the replacement working out. This wasn't superstition overriding practicality or practicality dismissing superstition. The two ran together, inseparably, in the actual decision a quartermaster made standing on some colonial dock, sizing up a litter of kittens or a grown cat somebody was willing to part with, trying to judge, from a few minutes' observation, whether this particular animal would prove worth the months of scraps and trust the crew was about to invest in it. There was, though, one animal aboard most Caribbean pirate vessels that solved a problem no cat ever could. Not rats, but hunger itself, in a form that could survive weeks in a ship's hold without so much as a drop of fresh water. And that's where tonight's journey turns next. Your name, tonight, is Manuel, ship's cook's mate on a Caribbean sloop somewhere off the Cayman Islands, and the sound that wakes you before dawn isn't bells or shouted orders. It's the low, patient scrape of something enormous shifting its weight in the hold beneath your hammock. That something is a green sea turtle, and by the time your voyage ends, it will not be alone down there. Here's the practical genius of it. The reason turtles occupy a place in the pirate diet that no other single food source quite matches. A green sea turtle, flipped onto its back on a ship's deck or lowered gently into the hold, can survive for weeks, genuinely weeks, not days, without food or water, kept alive purely by its own reserves. Meaning a crew could take on live turtles at one island and still have fresh meat on the hoof, so to speak, a month later, long after the goats and pigs taken aboard the same day had already gone into the pot. The French buccaneer surgeon Alexandre Exquemelin, whose 1678 account of life among the Hispaniola hunters gave the historical record its clearest window into the buccaneer world generally, wrote at length about turtle as a Caribbean staple, describing the meat as a genuine dietary mainstay for the entire buccaneer and pirate population of the region, not a delicacy or an occasional treat. You spend your first morning aboard learning the actual mechanics of it, and it's grimmer, slower work than anything the goat pen or the chicken coop ever demanded. A green turtle, hauled from shallow water where it's come to feed or nest, gets flipped onto its shell, a single motion that renders the animal almost completely helpless, since a sea turtle's body is built for swimming, not for righting itself against gravity on dry land or a wooden deck. And left there, alive, immobile, until the crew is ready to use it. This is the uncomfortable heart of the whole practice. Turtles were, functionally, a living larder, kept conscious and helpless for as long as their reserves allowed, which by any modern standard reads as genuinely difficult to sit with. You feel that discomfort yourself the first time you walk past one on your second day aboard, its flippers moving slowly against the air, and you notice most of the older hands don't look at it directly either, the same way nobody made eye contact with the pig before slaughter back in the manger. 3 days into the voyage, and you learn where this particular turtle came from. Because the ship put in briefly at a small quay 2 days before you signed aboard specifically to take turtles on. A stop the quartermaster planned as carefully as any provisioning run for water or biscuit. Certain islands and shoals across the Caribbean, most famously the Cayman Islands themselves, whose very name almost certainly derives from a Tano or Carib word for a species of crocodilian rather than the turtles, though the islands became so associated with turtle harvesting that European sailors used them as a reliable turtling ground for generations. Held nesting and feeding grounds dense enough that a landing party with reasonable luck could take several turtles in a single low-tide expedition. This wasn't guesswork or opportunism. It was a known, mapped, reliable resource passed along by word of mouth between crews, the same way good careening beaches or safe anchorages were, and a captain planning a long voyage would route past a known turtling ground the same deliberate way he'd route past a known source of fresh water. By your first week aboard, you've learned the actual butchering, and it's unlike anything the goat pen or hog pen ever demanded of you. Because a sea turtle shell requires real effort and the right tools to open properly. And Cooper, the same broad. Unhurried cook from other ships you've served on, or one very much like him, since every crew seems to have a Cooper, shows you exactly where to cut without wasting meat that took real effort to secure in the first place. The meat itself, dark and rich by most period accounts, was prized specifically because it didn't taste like the salt pork and dried fish the rest of the diet consisted of. A genuine structural break in the monotony that mattered as much for morale as for nutrition. Turtle soup, made from the animal's fat and cartilage simmered down slow, became popular enough across the broader Atlantic world that it persisted as a delicacy in European and colonial cooking for centuries after piracy itself had faded. A strange culinary afterlife for a practice that began purely as shipboard survival. Here's where the eyewitness texture of it matters, because you don't learn all of this from any single lecture. You piece it together the way every hand aboard does, second-hand, from older sailors telling you what they'd heard from older sailors still. A grizzled hand named Rourke, who sailed these waters twice as long as you've been alive, tells you one evening about a voyage years back, where a captain, running desperately short of food with weeks still to go before landfall, credited a single well-stocked hold of turtles with keeping the entire crew fed and functional through a crossing that should, by any reasonable arithmetic, have starved them. Whether the specific numbers in Rourke's story hold up to scrutiny is impossible to verify at this distance. Sailors' stories grow in the telling the way fish do, but the underlying claim that turtle stores genuinely saved crews from starvation on more than one documented occasion across the broader historical record is exactly the kind of practical value that made turtling worth the trouble in the first place. 2 weeks out, and you watch the crew's numbers-mindedness apply to turtles the same relentless way it applied to every other resource aboard. The quartermaster tracks the hold's turtle stock the same way he'd track water casks or powder barrels, because a turtle, unlike a chicken egg, represents a substantial, countable unit of future food, and running the count down without a plan for restocking before it hits zero is the kind of oversight that gets a quartermaster voted out of his post. You watch him make the calculation out loud one evening, dividing turtles remaining by weeks of voyage left, the same blunt, unsentimental arithmetic that decided Nan's fate on another ship entirely. And you understand, watching him work it, that this is simply how a well-run pirate vessel survives, not through daring alone, but through exactly this kind of unglamorous bookkeeping, applied to everything from powder to protein. 3 weeks out, and you get the closest thing to a joke this whole grim business offers. A young hand named Willette, new enough to still be embarrassed by his own seasickness, tries to right one of the turtles out of what he insists is simple curiosity about how the animal actually moves, and gets nowhere near fast enough when the turtle's flipper catches him across the shin hard enough to leave a bruise that draws laughter from half the watch. Even an animal rendered helpless by being flipped onto its shell, it turns out, isn't entirely without a last word on the matter, and for one evening the whole hold gets to laugh at something that isn't imminent death or spoiled rations, which counts for a great deal on a long voyage. By the fourth week, though, the lighter moment gives way to the part of this practice that's hardest to present without flinching, because it deserves honesty rather than a comfortable gloss. The last turtle in the hold, the one you woke to on your very first morning aboard, has been down there, alive, on its back, for the better part of a month by the time its turn finally comes. You're the one who does the actual work this time. Cooper standing close enough to correct you, but letting you handle the whole process yourself. Because this is, in its own unglamorous way, part of what it means to have signed the articles and taken a share of everything the voyage produces, food included. It's not an easy thing to do well the first time. You do it anyway, because 40-odd men are depending on this meat, lasting them through the empty stretch of open water still ahead, and because the alternative, turning back early for want of food, giving up a prize already 3 weeks in the taking, isn't one anybody aboard is prepared to accept. 5 weeks out, and the ship makes for a known turtling shoal to restock. The same deliberate routing decision that put the original animal in the hold in the first place, and you go ashore with the landing party this time, wading through warm, shallow water at first light, learning by doing what Rourke and Cooper had only been able to describe in words. It's exhausting, wet, unglamorous labour, flipping an animal that doesn't want to be flipped. Wrestling with a creature that can weigh more than a grown man, hauling it back to the boat through water that fights you at every step. And by the time you're done, hands raw, back aching, you've developed a real, grudging respect for how much deliberate skill this supposedly simple food source actually demanded. Here's the wonder worth sitting with, because it belongs in this chapter as much as the grimness does. Green sea turtles, the same species pirate crews harvested by the hundreds across the Caribbean's turtling grounds, are animals capable of migration spanning thousands of miles across open ocean, navigating by means science still doesn't fully understand even now, returning across entire ocean basins to nest on the very beaches where they themselves hatched, sometimes decades earlier. The crew hauling one of these animals up onto a ship's deck in 1715 had, without knowing it, interrupted a journey considerably older and stranger than their own voyage, a navigational feat no compass or chart of the era could have matched, ended, more often than not, in a ship's hold. By the time this voyage reaches its final landfall, the turtling grounds that fed you and 40 other hands for weeks on end have been visited by countless crews before yours, and would go on being visited by countless crews after, a resource so heavily and consistently exploited across the Golden Age that within a couple of centuries, the very abundance that made turtling such reliable insurance against starvation would decline sharply across much of the Caribbean, the same pattern that emptied Hispaniola's wild cattle herds decades earlier, repeating itself in the water this time instead of on land. You don't know any of that yet, standing on deck watching the last of the shoal disappear back into blue water behind the ship. You just know your stomach is full, your voyage is provisioned for weeks to come, and somewhere behind you, an animal built to cross oceans is finally, after a month in the dark, swimming free again. Turtles didn't only feed you as meat, either. Green turtles nest by hauling themselves up onto the same tropical beaches, sometimes the very same stretch of sand, year after year, digging a pit and burying a clutch that can run past 100 eggs at a time, and a landing party that timed its visit to the nesting season, which local pilots and experienced hands both knew roughly when to expect, could gather eggs by the basketful with none of the wrestling a live adult turtle demanded. You learn this on your third landfall this voyage, digging carefully into warm sand under Rourke's direction, and the eggs themselves turn out to have a soft, leathery shell unlike anything you'd find in the chicken coop back on deck, pliable enough that you can press a thumb into one without cracking it, which apparently makes them easier to pack for the voyage back without breaking half the hull before it's even loaded. Cooper fries a batch that same evening, and you eat better than you have in a week, and nobody aboard treats robbing an entire nest as anything but ordinary, sensible provisioning, the same unsentimental arithmetic that governs everything else this ship keeps alive to eat. What none of you know, standing on that beach with sand in your boots and a full basket between you, is that the very reliability of this resource, the fact that turtles kept returning to the same beaches generation after generation, predictable enough to plan a voyage around, is exactly what made the practice sustainable for pirates and devastating for the turtles themselves over the following 2 centuries, as colonial demand for both meat and eggs scaled up far beyond anything a single ship's crew could account for. The hunting itself carries real risk that the songs never mention, and you learn this firsthand on your second turtling expedition, when a green turtle considerably larger than the ones you'd handled so far very nearly takes a landing boat over with it. A grown green turtle can weigh well past 200 pounds, dense muscle and heavy shell, and an animal that size, thrashing in panic in shallow water, is entirely capable of swamping a small boat if the men aboard mishandle the flip. You watch it happen to the boat 2 places down from yours, 3 men pitched into the shallows, soaked, furious, one of them nursing a wrenched shoulder from where the turtle's flipper caught him wrong on the way over, and the whole landing party spends a good 10 minutes afterward more concerned with fishing gear and weapons out of the surf than with the turtle itself, which has, in the confusion, simply swum off entirely, its month or 2 of captivity avoided by pure accident. Rourke tells you afterward, with the particular satisfaction of a man who's been proven right about a danger nobody else took seriously, that he's seen a turtling accident put a man out of working condition for weeks, and that the sea itself doesn't much care whether the thing that hurts you is a Spanish cutlass or an animal you are trying to eat. You believe him. Your own hands are still shaking slightly from the near miss, and it takes you the better part of the walk back to camp to talk yourself back into steady. There's a second economy running alongside the meat entirely, and it belongs to a different species than the ones filling your own ship's hold, though the distinction matters enough to be worth drawing clearly. The hawksbill turtle, smaller and considerably rarer in most Caribbean waters than the green turtle your crew hunts for food, carries a shell prized across European and colonial markets for an entirely different reason. Worked and polished, hawksbill shell produced the mottled amber material known as tortoise shell, used for combs, spectacle frames, and decorative inlay work sold at a price that made a single good shell worth considerably more than the animal's meat ever would. Pirate crews operating in waters where hawksbills were more common than green turtles occasionally targeted them specifically for this reason, treating the shell as cargo in the same category as the parrots and monkeys covered elsewhere tonight, plunder chosen deliberately for its resale value rather than its calories. You never personally handle a hawksbill this voyage, since the waters your ship favours run thicker with green turtles than the rarer species, but Cooper mentions the trade in passing one evening, describing a captured hawksbill shell he once saw change hands in a colonial port, for a sum that startled him at the time. More coin for a single shell than a green turtle's entire body was worth in meat. It's a small, telling detail about how thoroughly the entire animal economy surrounding a pirate ship ran on whatever value a given creature could be converted into, whether that value came from its stomach or its shell. Here's the long shadow this practice casts, worth including because it reframes the whole chapter's scale. The turtling grounds your ship depends on this voyage didn't stop being valuable once the Golden Age of Piracy faded. They continued supplying Caribbean shipping, colonial settlements, and eventually a substantial commercial turtle soup trade for Europe and the American colonies for another 2 centuries after your own voyage ends, with the Cayman Islands specifically building an entire local economy and cultural identity around turtling that persisted in various forms into the 20th century. That continuity is, in its own way, a form of the same wonder this chapter keeps circling back to, a single resource. First tapped by opportunistic hunters and pirate crews solving an immediate hunger problem, sustaining an entire regional economy for generations after the ships that first exploited it had rotted at anchor or been broken up for salvage. It's also, less comfortably, a story about depletion. The green turtle populations that seemed, from the deck of your ship tonight, functionally inexhaustible, would, by the 20th century, require deliberate international conservation efforts to prevent outright collapse, the direct, centuries-long consequence of exactly the kind of provisioning voyage you're living through right now. You don't know any of that yet. Tonight, the turtling ground is simply generous, reliable, and exactly where the charts said it would be, and that's as much as anyone aboard needs to understand before the next watch begins. Turtles occasionally changed hands between ships entirely, the same way goats and chickens did back aboard Josiah's vessel, and you witness exactly this a little past the voyage's midpoint, when your ship crosses paths with another Caribbean crew running short on fresh meat after a longer, harder crossing than yours. A quick exchange follows. 2 of your remaining turtles traded across in open water for a keg of good rum and a promise of goodwill should your paths cross again under less friendly circumstances someday. Nobody aboard treats the transaction as unusual. A live turtle, patient and portable in a way almost nothing else in a ship's hold could match, functioned as a kind of currency in its own right among crews, who understood exactly what weeks of guaranteed fresh meat was worth to a hungry ship, regardless of whose articles that ship sailed under. You watch the other crew's boat pull away with your 2 turtles lashed carefully amidships, and something about the exchange strikes you as oddly civil for 2 ships that might, under different circumstances entirely, have tried to take everything from each other by force instead. Rourke, watching the same exchange, tells you this happens more than you'd think, that turtles, precisely because they demand so little upkeep and last so long, make an easy, low-stakes gift between crews looking to smooth over old grudges or simply build the kind of loose, informal goodwill that might matter later, in open water, when a fast friend counts for more than a fast ship. It's a small, almost gentle detail to find tucked inside an otherwise violent trade, and you file it away without quite knowing what to do with it yet. Turtles solved hunger the practical way through arithmetic and patience and a strong stomach. The next animal to earn its place aboard solved something else entirely, something no ship's ledger ever had a column for, where the goat, the cat, and the turtle earned their berth through arithmetic, water consumed, rats killed, weeks of hunger bought outright. The parrot and the monkey earned theirs through something closer to vanity. And the story of how that happened runs straight through one of the most influential pieces of pirate fiction ever written, published more than a century and a half after the Golden Age itself had ended. In 1883, a Scottish novelist named Robert Louis Stevenson published a serialized adventure story called Treasure Island, and somewhere in its pages he gave his villain, the one-legged Long John Silver, a green parrot named Captain Flint, who perches on Silver's shoulder and repeats, in a cracked, mechanical voice, the phrase, "pieces of 8." That single fictional bird did more to shape the modern popular image of a pirate than almost any actual historical account from the period it claims to depict. Ask most people today to picture a pirate, and the parrot arrives in their imagination before the cutlass does, a detail invented for a Victorian boy's adventure novel, retroactively assumed to be documented history. So, welcome to a chapter about untangling that, because underneath the fictional parrot, there's a real, considerably more interesting trade in exotic animals that pirates genuinely participated in, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with looking picturesque. Here's the actual mechanism. Golden Age piracy operated heavily in the Caribbean and, later in the era, along the African and Indian Ocean coasts and the waters around Madagascar, regions rich in exactly the kind of colourful, exotic wildlife that a European or colonial buyer back home had never seen and would pay well for. Parrots native to the Caribbean and South American mainland, and various species of small monkey found across those same coastal regions represented genuine, portable, high-value cargo in exactly the same category as silk, spices, or fine cloth taken from a captured prize. A pirate crew stopping in a port with informal trading connections, and pirate economies depended heavily on exactly these informal networks, since no legitimate merchant would openly trade with a wanted crew, could turn a captured or purchased exotic bird into hard currency more easily than a lot of other plunder, because demand for novelty pets among wealthy Europeans was real and consistent. This is where the record gets genuinely murky, and it's worth being honest about that murkiness rather than smoothing it over. Specific, well-documented accounts of individual named pirates keeping individual named parrots as personal companions, the way popular culture imagines it, one bird, one captain, one shoulder, are thin on the ground in primary sources from the era itself. What survives more reliably are broader references, some from trial depositions and colonial correspondence, describing exotic animals aboard captured or searched vessels generally as part of cargo inventories rather than personal pets. The leap from cargo to beloved shoulder companion is exactly the kind of dramatisation Charles Johnson's 1724 account specialised in, and later writers, right through to Stevenson, ran with it because it made for better fiction than an itemised cargo manifest ever could. That said, and this matters, the leap isn't entirely invented out of nothing. Sailors across the whole age of sail, not just pirates, had well-documented habits of keeping informal shipboard pets, and monkeys in particular show up repeatedly in period accounts as genuinely popular, because a monkey provided something almost nothing else aboard could: entertainment. Months at sea, with nothing but the same 80 or so faces, the same rationed food, and the same rigging to maintain, wears on morale in ways that are easy to underestimate from dry land. A monkey capable of mimicking a sailor's gestures, stealing food with theatrical audacity, or simply doing something unpredictable in an environment governed almost entirely by routine, had genuine value that had nothing to do with money. Consider the practical reality of actually keeping one aboard, because it undercuts the romantic image almost immediately. A monkey, unlike a goat, cannot be reasoned with about rationed water, cannot be penned effectively in a rolling ship without serious cruelty, and will, with total reliability, get into anything left unsecured: food stores, navigational instruments. A captain's private stock of anything worth stealing. Surviving general accounts from across the era describe monkeys as charming right up until they weren't, at which point they became one more mouth competing for scarce resources, prone to illness in conditions their native climate hadn't prepared them for, and just as likely to die of cold, poor diet, or simple bad luck on a long Atlantic crossing as to survive it and reach a buyer. Here's the part worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the quieter, sadder truth sitting underneath the whole exotic pet trade. Most of these animals, parrot and monkey alike, weren't chosen companions in any sentimental sense at all. They were captured wildlife, taken from their home range, kept in unfamiliar and often cruel conditions, and transported toward a market that valued them as novelty objects rather than living creatures. Where the historical record does hint at genuine attachment, a particular bird kept past the point it made economic sense to sell, a particular monkey a crew seemed reluctant to part with in port. It reads less like sentiment and more like the same pattern as the goat named Nan from a few chapters back. Men isolated from ordinary domestic life, months from home, quietly, half-admittedly, forming attachments to whatever softened the isolation, whether or not that attachment made any economic sense. There's a final wrinkle worth including, because it's genuinely documented and genuinely strange. Trial records and depositions from pirate prosecutions occasionally list exotic animals among the confiscated property of captured crews, evidence, alongside the coin and cloth, of what a particular voyage had actually accumulated. Reading a list like that today is an odd experience, alongside gold dust and bolts of silk, an itemized parrot, valued, seized, and presumably sold off by the Crown, along with everything else the condemned men could no longer claim. Consider the actual mechanics of transporting a parrot across an ocean, because it clarifies just how much deliberate effort the trade actually demanded, effort easy to skip past, when the end result is a single vivid image of a bird on a shoulder. A parrot taken from the wild in the Caribbean or along the South American coast needed to survive weeks or months aboard ship before ever reaching a buyer. Through changes in climate, diet, and confinement that period accounts suggest killed a meaningful proportion of captured birds before they ever saw a market stall. Feed had to be found or improvised from whatever grain or fruit the ship carried, itself already rationed carefully among the human crew. A parrot that arrived at its destination healthy enough to fetch a good price represented, in a very real sense, weeks of somebody's deliberate attention and care, however commercially motivated that care might have been. There's a specific, well-documented irony worth including here, because it undercuts the popular image in an unexpectedly satisfying way. Robert Louis Stevenson, when he sat down to write Treasure Island in 1881 and 1882, drew heavily on earlier pirate literature and travel accounts for his details, and scholars researching the novel's sources have traced Long John Silver's parrot back to exactly the kind of exotic animal trading accounts described above. Real trade, filtered through decades of retelling, condensed into one unforgettable fictional detail. Stevenson wasn't inventing the parrot-pirate connection from nothing. He was taking a genuine, if considerably less romantic, trading practice and compressing it into the single most efficient possible symbol a 19th century reader could instantly recognize. That's worth remembering next time a costume or a cartoon reaches for a parrot on a pirate's shoulder. The image is fiction, but the fiction has real roots. Picture 2. The specific danger a monkey posed to a ship's actual operation, because period general accounts of shipboard animal mischief are consistent enough across different vessels and different eras to suggest this wasn't occasional bad luck, but a predictable, recurring cost of keeping one aboard at all. A monkey loose in the rigging could genuinely interfere with sail handling at exactly the wrong moment. A real hazard aboard a ship that might need to come about quickly to avoid a reef or outrun a pursuing naval vessel. Some crews, according to broader period accounts of shipboard animals generally, eventually resorted to keeping particularly troublesome monkeys tethered or caged for exactly this reason, which rather undercuts the charming, free-roaming image popular culture prefers. The tension between a monkey's entertainment value and its capacity for genuine operational disruption seems to have been a real, ongoing negotiation aboard any ship that kept one, rather than a settled, comfortable arrangement. Here's a detail that deserves the same careful disputed versus documented framing the accuracy rules ask for tonight, because it's exactly the kind of claim that tends to get repeated as settled fact when it isn't. Various popular retellings over the centuries have attributed specific pet monkeys and parrots to specific named Golden Age pirates, Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and others, usually without a primary source anywhere near the claim, often traceable, when you follow the citation trail back far enough, to nothing sturdier than a later novelist's invention repeated so many times it calcified into apparent history. Treat any specific claim of this kind you encounter elsewhere with real skepticism, the same skepticism Charles Johnson's own 1724 account deserves generally. What's solidly documented is the trade and the general practice, not the specific celebrity pet. There's a genuinely tender thread worth pulling here too, though, because not every account of a shipboard exotic pet reads as pure commercial calculation. Sailors' journals and letters from across the broader age of sail, not exclusively pirate sources, but drawn from the same maritime culture pirates operated within, occasionally describe a particular bird or monkey kept well past the point of easy profit, fed better than commercial sense would dictate, mourned genuinely when it died at sea of cold or illness before ever reaching a buyer. This pattern echoes something you've already heard tonight. In Nan the Goat, and in the countless unnamed ship's cats worked into quiet reverence, men isolated for months at a stretch, far from anything resembling ordinary domestic life, forming real attachments to whatever creature happened to be nearby and willing to be looked after, whether or not the ledger ever recorded that attachment as anything other than cargo. By the time a surviving bird or monkey finally reached a colonial port and changed hands for good coin, it had usually outlived most of the other creatures that started the same voyage in the same hold. The goats eaten, the chickens laid out one by one, the pigs long since salted into barrels. The exotic pet's survival wasn't really about being valued more. It was simply the one animal aboard whose entire purpose depended on staying alive all the way to market, which made it, almost by accident, the only creature on the whole ship with genuinely aligned interests to the crew's own. Everybody involved wanted this one, specifically, to make it through the voyage in one piece. Not every exotic bird pirates handled came from the Caribbean. Either Golden Age Piracy's later years pushed crews increasingly toward the African coast and the Indian Ocean routes around Madagascar, chasing East India Company shipping loaded with silks and spices worth far more than anything the Caribbean trade offered, and West Africa carried its own valuable bird in the African grey parrot. Prized across European markets for a vocal mimicry, considered even more accomplished than the Caribbean species pirates had grown used to trading. A crew operating off the West African coast, raiding slave ships and merchant vessels alike, encountered African greys as part of the same general cargo and plunder economy that governed exotic animals everywhere pirates operated. And the bird's reputation for exceptional mimicry meant a healthy specimen could fetch a genuinely striking price from a buyer back in London or Lisbon. This detail matters for a harder reason too, one worth stating plainly rather than skating past. Pirate activity along this coast operated in direct proximity to, and sometimes in direct participation with, the transatlantic slave trade. And any honest account of exotic animal trafficking in these waters has to acknowledge that the same ships, the same routes, and often the same crews were simultaneously involved in the trafficking of human beings under conditions of almost unimaginable cruelty. The parrot trade was real. It was also a minor, almost incidental thread within a far larger and far darker commercial system that this particular stretch of ocean was built around, and it would be a disservice to the actual history to mention one without acknowledging the other. Consider, too, the specific diplomatic use exotic animals occasionally served, beyond straightforward market sale. Colonial governors across the Caribbean and, later, the Indian Ocean trading world occupied a genuinely awkward position regarding piracy, officially charged with suppressing it, but frequently dependent, in practice, on exactly the kind of informal trade pirate crews brought into their ports, since a colonial economy starved of the coin. Goods and labour pirates could supply often struggled badly without it. Exotic animals functioned, in a documented if relatively minor way, as a kind of social lubricant in this uncomfortable relationship. A parrot or a monkey presented as a gift to a governor's household or to his wife or children carried a different weight than an equivalent sum in coin, softening a relationship that both sides had strong practical reasons to maintain, without ever officially acknowledging it. This wasn't universal, and it wasn't formalized into any kind of protocol worth calling diplomacy in the modern sense. But the pattern shows up often enough across period correspondence and later historical accounts of specific corrupt or complicit colonial administrations to be treated as a real, if minor, feature of how piracy actually sustained itself, not purely through violence and plunder, but through exactly this kind of quiet, animal-mediated social transaction between men who officially considered each other enemies and unofficially needed each other rather badly. Here's a detail worth including for how it complicates who actually deserves credit for the exotic animal trade's practical success. European sailors themselves were, by most accounts, fairly poor at actually catching wild parrots and monkeys without guidance, and the techniques that made the trade viable at all were overwhelmingly learned from, or performed by, the indigenous Caribbean and mainland peoples, and in some documented cases enslaved or formerly enslaved individuals, who possessed genuine expertise a European sailor simply didn't have. Reading a wild parrot's flight patterns to locate a nest, understanding which fruits would lure a monkey close enough to trap without frightening the whole troop into the canopy, judging which young birds could be hand-reared into tame, saleable adults versus which would simply die of stress in captivity. None of this was intuitive to a sailor whose entire skill set revolved around rigging and navigation. Pirate crews trading in exotic animals depended, whether the historical record credits it clearly or not, on knowledge systems considerably older and more sophisticated than anything the trade's European buyers ever bothered learning themselves, extracted and monetized the same way so much else about this era's colonial economy extracted value from people, and knowledge it rarely credited honestly. Picture the actual sale, finally, because it's the part of the whole trade the popular imagination skips entirely in favour of the shoulder parrot image. A colonial port market of this period handled exotic animal sales the same unceremonious way it handled most other goods, informal, negotiated, often conducted dockside within hours of a ship making landfall, since a crew eager to convert plunder into spendable coin had little patience for waiting around for a better offer. A parrot or monkey that survived the crossing went for whatever a buyer on hand that particular afternoon was willing to pay, sometimes considerably less than its theoretical market value, simply because the selling crew wanted cash in hand before the evening's drinking began. There was no guaranteed buyer, no reliable pricing, no protection against a bad day at market, undercutting weeks of careful feeding and attention, keeping the animal alive during the crossing. This uncertainty, more than almost anything else, explains why exotic animals never rivaled coin, silver, or fine cloth as a pirate crew's plunder of choice, however much the popular imagination has come to associate the two. It was a real trade, a real source of income, and a real thread running through the era's broader economy, but a minor one, propping up the far more reliable, far less romantic business of taking coin directly from a captured hold. There's a broader cultural context worth including, because it explains why European buyers wanted these animals so badly in the first place, beyond simple novelty. The 17th and 18th centuries saw a genuine explosion of interest across wealthy European households in what were then called cabinets of curiosities, private collections of unusual natural specimens, shells, minerals, preserved creatures, and, where the household could manage it, living exotic animals, all assembled as a display of wealth, worldliness, and intellectual fashion rolled into one. A living parrot or monkey, capable of demonstrating its exoticism through sound and movement rather than sitting inert on a shelf, held genuine appeal within this collecting culture that a dead specimen simply couldn't match. Pirate crews trading captured birds and monkeys into colonial ports were, whether they thought of it in these terms or not, feeding directly into this broader European fashion for living proof of the wider world, the same fashion that drove far more organised and far better funded scientific and commercial expeditions of the period to bring back specimens of their own. The pirate trade was smaller, rougher, and considerably less carefully documented than those official expeditions, but it was tapping the exact same market appetite, one crate or one cage at a time. This context also explains something about why the trade, however grim its actual mechanics, persisted as reliably as it did across the whole Golden Age. Fashions in furniture or fine cloth shifted with the season, but the appeal of a living, vocal, visibly foreign creature in a wealthy household's parlour proved remarkably durable across decades, which meant a pirate crew with a healthy parrot or monkey to sell could reasonably expect a buyer somewhere along the colonial trading network, voyage after voyage, in a way that wasn't true of every category of plunder. It's one more small piece of the larger picture this whole night keeps returning to. Piracy's economy ran on considerably more than gold alone, and the animals threaded through nearly every part of it, whether as food, as labour, as companionship, or, in this case, as a fashionable, living curiosity destined for a stranger's parlour an ocean away from where it was born. Not every animal aboard came from a market stall or a captured cargo hold, though some of them came from a much older, much rougher tradition, one that predates organised Caribbean piracy by decades and gave the word buccaneer its name. Picture Hispaniola, sometime in the middle decades of the 17th century, well before the Golden Age proper has really begun. Your name, tonight, is Guillaume, and you are not technically a pirate. Not yet, and maybe not ever, depending how the next few years go. Right now, you are what the Spanish call, with open contempt, a cimarron-adjacent nuisance, and what the French who share this stretch of coast with you call a boucanier, a man who hunts the wild cattle and pigs that roam this island in numbers nobody bothered to count, and smokes the meat over a particular kind of wooden frame the local Tano people called a boucan, a word that will eventually, through French mouths and English ears, curdle into buccaneer and end up meaning something considerably more violent than meat smoker. Here's the origin story, and it's genuinely documented rather than legendary, largely thanks to a French barber surgeon named Alexandre Exquemeline, who lived and worked among exactly this population in the 1660s and published an account of it in 1678, a source scholars generally treat as far more reliable than Charles Johnson's later, more sensationalised work, precisely because Exquemeline was there, doing the work himself, rather than compiling second-hand court records decades after the fact. Spanish colonisation of Hispaniola in the previous century had brought cattle and pigs to the island as livestock, the same practical logic that would later see goats deliberately released on Pacific islands as a standing food reserve for future sailors. Over generations, some of that Spanish livestock escaped or was abandoned when Spanish settlement patterns shifted and went thoroughly, spectacularly feral, breeding into herds substantial enough to sustain an entire informal economy of hunters who answered to no crown at all. You wake before dawn, because the hunting is better in the cool hours, and the smell that greets you is smoke, always smoke, from yesterday's boucan still working, curing yesterday's kill into something that will keep for months without salt, which matters enormously out here, since salt is expensive and hard to come by while wild cattle, at least for now, are not. You check your matchlock, worn smooth from handling, and head out with 2 dogs bred and trained specifically for this work. Animals valued so highly among the buccaneers that a good hunting dog reportedly changed hands for considerably more than an indentured servant's contract. A detail Exquemelin himself records with something like grim amusement. By mid-morning, you've run down and killed a wild bull, and the real work begins. Not the killing, which takes minutes, but the butchering and smoking, hours of it, in heat that makes the whole process miserable, hunched over a bocarm frame, turning strips of meat while flies gather and your hands go raw from the work. Here's the trade you're making, whether you've fully articulated it to yourself yet or not. A hard, filthy, independent existence, answering to no plantation owner, no naval officer, no colonial governor, in exchange for a life that could end from a Spanish patrol, a wild bull's horn, or simple infection, with nobody keeping careful records of your existence at all. Consider the dogs more closely, because Exquemelin's own account gives them more attention than almost any other animal in his entire narrative, and that attention is worth honouring rather than skimming past. A buccaneer's hunting dog was trained specifically to run down wild cattle and pigs across genuinely difficult terrain, dense scrub, steep ravines, ground that would exhaust an unconditioned man within the hour, and to hold a cornered animal at bay without getting gored or trampled in the process. A skill that took real, patient training to instill and real risk to maintain once the dog was actually working. Exquemelin records the going price for a good, proven hunting dog as substantially higher than what a man might pay for an indentured servant's remaining years of labour. A genuinely striking comparison that tells you exactly how this particular economy valued skilled animal labour against unskilled human labour. However uncomfortable that comparison sits with modern sensibilities, you spend a full day partway through your second year hunting, watching one particular dog work, a lean, scarred animal the other hunters simply call Loop, Wolf, for reasons nobody bothers explaining to you directly. Loop doesn't simply chase, he reads the herd the way a good quartermaster reads a crew, cutting off a wounded animal's retreat before it fully registers it's been separated, holding position at exactly the right distance to keep a cornered boar's attention without inviting the charge that would gut him. You watch a hunter you don't know well lose his footing on wet ground during exactly this kind of standoff, and Loop, without any command you can identify, shifts his position just enough to draw the boar's attention away from the fallen man for the 2 or 3 seconds it takes him to scramble clear. Nobody makes a fuss about it afterward. This is simply what a good dog does, and everybody here has seen it before. Here's the part that complicates any easy story about hunting dog loyalty being purely transactional, though, because the record resists a tidy answer either way. These dogs lived hard, short working lives by any standard, exposed to the same heat, the same risk of injury from a cornered animal's horns or tusks, the same general deprivation as the men who owned them, with none of the formal compensation the men themselves, decades later as pirates proper, would eventually write into their ship's articles for a lost eye or limb. A wounded dog, unable to hunt, simply stopped being useful, and what happened next isn't spelled out clearly in the surviving sources, which is itself a kind of answer. And yet the emotional register running through Exquemelin's own descriptions of these hunting partnerships reads as something more than pure transaction. Men who clearly knew their dogs individually, valued specific animals for specific qualities of skill and temperament, and in at least the general pattern the source describes. Grieved a good dog's loss the way you'd expect anyone to grieve losing a genuinely skilled, genuinely trusted partner in dangerous, isolating work. 3 years into this life, well past the point where you first learned to smoke meat over a bocun frame. The Spanish cull that will eventually push you toward Tortuga has already begun in earnest, and you spend an increasingly desperate season watching the herds thin around you in real time. This is where the animal hunting economy's fragility becomes impossible to ignore. A hunting ground that seemed, only a few years earlier, to hold cattle in numbers beyond counting, turns out to have a bottom after all, once a colonial power with real resources decides deliberately to find it. You and the other hunters range further afield each season, covering ground that would have seemed absurd to walk 2 years earlier, chasing herds pushed deeper into terrain even the Spanish patrols find difficult to reach. Here's a detail worth sitting with honestly, because it complicates the freedom this chapter has otherwise celebrated. The Spanish cull campaign wasn't simply a tactic aimed at starving out an inconvenient population of independent hunters. It was, in its own right, a mass slaughter of animals on a scale that dwarfs anything the buccaneers themselves were doing. Cattle killed not for meat or hide, but purely to deny them to men like you. Carcasses left to rot where they fell rather than harvested at all. You come across the aftermath of exactly this kind of Spanish culling operation once, a stretch of ground littered with carcasses that nobody bothered to smoke, salt, or use in any way, and something about the waste of it. Animals killed purely as a tactic, not even eaten, sits worse with you than almost anything the actual hunting demanded of you personally. By the time the wild herds thin out enough to make hunting unreliable, you and men like you face a choice that Exquemelin's own account traces out clearly. Move to the small island of Tortuga, off Hispaniola's northern coast, where a rough, semi-organised community of former hunters was consolidating into something closer to an actual base of operations. Or take up privateering and outright piracy directly, since the skills that made you a good hunter of wild cattle transferred with uncomfortable ease to the skills that made you a good raider of Spanish shipping. Most of the men who'd spent years learning to track, kill, and butcher large animals with matchlocks and machetes made that second choice, once the first one stopped being viable. By the time you reach Tortuga, Loop has died, not dramatically, not in some final heroic stand against a charging bull, but slowly, from a wound that never healed properly. Over a season you watched happen and couldn't do much about beyond keeping him fed and out of the worst heat during his last weeks. The hunter who owned him doesn't say much when it finally happens. He buries the dog himself, alone, on a stretch of ground he apparently picked out weeks in advance, once it became clear which way things were heading. You help him dig, because it seems like the decent thing to do, and neither of you talks about it again afterward. And somehow, that silence says as much as anything either of you could have put into words. Here's the through line worth carrying forward, because it explains something the rest of this script has been circling around without naming directly. The entire economic and cultural foundation of Caribbean buccaneering, the word itself, the community structure, the informal codes of shared risk that would later crystallize into written pirate articles, grew directly out of an animal hunting economy first. Piracy didn't spring up independently and then acquire livestock as an afterthought. In a very real sense, the animals came first, and the pirates grew out of the arrangement men had already built around hunting them. Consider what 4 years of this life actually does to a man's body, because Exquemelin's own account dwells on it more than a modern reader might expect. The buccaneer diet ran almost entirely to meat, beef and pork, smoked or fresh, with little in the way of bread, vegetables, or the varied provisions even a poorly run ship might carry. Some period observers, Exquemelin among them, noted health problems among the hunters that a more balanced diet might have prevented, though the exact medical understanding of the period couldn't name the mechanism with any precision. You notice it yourself, partway through your second year, in the way your own gums have started to ache in a manner that reminds you uncomfortably of scurvy stories you'd heard from sailors on proper ships. An irony worth sitting with, since scurvy is popularly associated with sailors starved of fresh meat, and here you are, drowning in fresh meat, missing something else entirely that the ship-bound sailors, for all their salted rations, occasionally got from the citrus and provisions their captains carried specifically to prevent exactly this problem. Exquemelin himself would go on to become a genuinely skilled surgeon later in his career, and it's not hard to imagine his years among the buccaneers, watching men in strong physical condition nonetheless develop mysterious ailments from a diet built on nothing but wild meat as part of what shaped that later expertise. The meat was never the whole business, either. Alongside the smoked strips you're curing over the Bocan fire, the wild cattle's hides represent a second, entirely separate stream of value, dried and salted and eventually bundled for sale to whatever trading vessel puts in along this stretch of coast, willing to deal informally with men the Spanish crown considers little better than criminals. Leather commanded real, steady demand across the European and colonial markets of this period. For boots, harness, bookbinding, 100 mundane uses that never once required anyone at the buying end to think too hard about where the hide had originally come from. You spend part of nearly every hunt scraping and salting hide alongside the meat smoking work, a second full job layered atop the first, and the two together, meat and leather, make the wild cattle of Hispaniola worth considerably more to a hunter than either product would be alone. This dual economy, protein for the buccaneers' own survival, leather for the coin that eventually bought powder, shot, and the occasional replacement matchlock, is a large part of why the hunting life, however brutal, sustained itself as a viable way to live for as long as it did, right up until the Spanish cull finally broke the herds it depended on. Here's the part of this story that explains something the rest of tonight's journey has been quietly building toward. The specific skills a hunting life like yours demanded translated into piracy with an ease that should probably unsettle you more than it does. Patience under difficult conditions, reading an opponent's movement and anticipating where it would go next, working effectively in small, tightly coordinated groups where every man's actions depended on trusting the others completely, because a mistake in a cattle hunt could gore you exactly as thoroughly as a mistake in a boarding action could. Marksmanship, honed over years of taking down a moving target at range with a single shot, since ammunition was too precious to waste on a second attempt. When men like you eventually did take up piracy in earnest contemporary observers on both sides, Spanish colonial officials writing anxious reports back to their superiors, and the buccaneers' own later chroniclers, remarked specifically on how disciplined and effective former hunters proved as raiders, compared to men without that particular hard-won background. The Spanish crown, in other words, had spent decades running a training program for its own future tormentors without ever intending to, simply by pushing men out onto Hispaniola's frontier to hunt an animal the Spanish themselves had originally brought there. By the time you actually reach Tortuga yourself, the island has already developed a rough, functioning system of its own, shaped directly by men who'd spent years learning, out of necessity, how to organise shared risk and shared reward among people with no crown or church willing to enforce agreements for them. This is, historically, where some of the earliest documented versions of what would later become formal pirate articles took shape. Informal codes among the hunters and early buccaneers governing how a kill got divided, how disputes got settled, how a wounded man got looked after when he could no longer hunt or fight. It's not a straight, unbroken line from a Bocan fire to assigned ship's articles decades later, and the historical record doesn't support pretending otherwise with false precision. But the underlying logic that shared danger demanded shared, negotiated compensation worked out among the men actually bearing the risk rather than imposed by some distant authority, clearly migrated with the hunters themselves, from the cattle country of Hispaniola's interior to the decks of the ships Tortuga's community would eventually crew. You arrive carrying that logic in your bones without necessarily having words for it yet, the same way you arrived carrying a hunter's patience and a marksman's eye, useful for entirely different work than the work that first taught it to you. There's a specific piece of material culture worth including here, because it left its own mark on the broader historical record independent of anything the hunters did with it. The long-barreled flintlock firearm the buccaneers favoured and gradually refined for exactly this kind of hunting, accurate at range, reliable enough to trust a single shot to bring down a moving animal from a real distance. Developed a reputation across the wider Caribbean for genuine quality, distinct enough from standard European military muskets of the period that colonial observers occasionally commented on it specifically. Some historians trace part of the later buccaneer-turned-pirate reputation for effective marksmanship directly to this equipment, refined over years of hunting necessity long before any of it was ever pointed at another ship's crew instead of a wild bull. You carry a version of exactly this weapon yourself, inherited from a hunter who taught you to use it properly during your first uncertain months on Hispaniola, and by now, 2 years in, it feels less like a tool you picked up and more like an extension of your own arm, trusted in a way few possessions ever manage to be. Here's a detail worth including for how it complicates any simple national story about who the buccaneers actually were. The hunting communities of Hispaniola drew men from French, English, and Dutch backgrounds alike, alongside escaped or freed men of African descent, and a smaller number of indigenous Caribbean people who'd survived the catastrophic population collapse the earlier century of Spanish colonization had inflicted on the region. A genuinely mixed, informal society organized far more around shared trade and shared risk than around any single nation's flag or any single ethnic identity. Exquemelin himself, writing as a Frenchman embedded among a population that included plenty of Englishmen he had every official reason to consider enemies back in Europe, describes a working camaraderie among the hunters that mattered more, day to day, than which crown any particular man had originally sailed under. This same pattern, practical necessity overriding national rivalry, would carry forward directly into the pirate crews these hunters eventually joined. Crews that, as earlier chapters tonight have already touched on, routinely mixed English, French, Dutch, and African hands under a single set of articles, answering to a captain and a quartermaster rather than to any distant king. It would be dishonest, too, to let this chapter's genuine admiration for buccaneer self-sufficiency slide into something more romantic than the actual life allowed. This was, by any measure, an existence almost entirely stripped of ordinary domestic life. No wives, no children, no settled household. None of the ordinary social fabric that governed life in the plantation towns and colonial ports these men had mostly fled or been pushed out of. The dogs, in this light, mattered as more than working animals. They were, for many hunters, close to the only sustained, dependent relationship available to them at all. In a world that had otherwise stripped away almost every other form of ordinary companionship a man might expect across an entire lifetime. That's worth sitting with honestly, rather than glossing over in favour of the hunting life's genuine freedoms, because both things were true at once, a life freer of colonial and feudal obligation than almost anyone else in this part of the world could claim, and a life genuinely, structurally lonely in ways the freedom didn't fully compensate for, a tension this whole night's journey keeps circling back to, in one form or another, animal by animal, chapter by chapter. That arithmetic would follow the buccaneers turned pirates onto the water, and, decades later and an ocean away, it would strand one particular sailor entirely alone. With nothing but feral goats, half-wild cats, and his own considerable stubbornness to keep him alive. His name was Alexander Selkirk, and by the time his story becomes genuinely useful for understanding shipboard animals, he's already been put ashore against his will on an uninhabited Pacific island roughly 400 miles off the coast of Chile in the year 1704. And he will not see another human face for slightly more than 4 years. The ship he sailed on, the Cinque Ports, was a privateer, a vessel operating under government license to raid enemy shipping, which made its crew legally distinct from outright pirates, though the men themselves, the practices aboard, and the general lawlessness of the enterprise would have looked functionally identical to anyone watching from shore. Selkirk served as sailing master under a captain named Thomas Stradling, on a voyage that was part of a larger expedition led by the buccaneer-turned-explorer William Dampier, a genuinely fascinating figure in his own right, a man who moved fluidly between piracy, privateering, and serious scientific natural history observation, sometimes within the same voyage. By late 1704, the Cinque Ports was in bad shape, worm-eaten, poorly maintained, and Selkirk, convinced the ship was no longer seaworthy enough to survive the voyage home, argued furiously with Stradling that the whole crew should put in at the nearest island and refit rather than press on. Stradling refused. Selkirk, in a fit of temper that historians generally agree he regretted almost immediately, announced he'd rather be marooned than sail another mile on that ship. Stradling, in what may be one of history's pettiest and most consequential decisions, simply agreed and left him there on an island called Tierra, part of what's now known as the Juan Fernandez Archipelago, with his sea chest, his weapons, some tobacco, a Bible, and very little else. Here's where the animals enter the story and where it becomes directly, powerfully relevant to everything this script has covered so far. Because Tierra, like so many islands along the sailing routes of the age, had been stocked with feral goats generations earlier, deliberately released by earlier Spanish sailors as exactly the kind of standing food reserve mentioned back in the opening chapter of tonight's journey. Selkirk, alone, frightened, and initially in real despair, surviving accounts describe him sitting on the shore for the better part of his first weeks, watching the horizon, unable to eat or sleep properly, eventually turned to hunting those same feral goats for meat, using skills that, whether he'd have phrased it this way or not, ran in a direct historical line back to the buccaneers of Hispaniola decades earlier. Within his first year, Selkirk had built 2 huts from pimento trees, taught himself to make fire by rubbing wood together after his gunpowder ran out, and had grown skilled enough at running down goats on foot, the island's terrain apparently steep and difficult enough that a fit, desperate man could genuinely outpace a goat over rough ground, that meat stopped being his primary concern. His memoirs and the later accounts drawn from his rescue describe him marking the ears of goats he caught, but chose to release, rather than kill, a small, oddly tender practice that let him track, years later, exactly how long an individual animal had been free. One specific goat, according to the record, was recaptured with an earmark showing it had lived at large on the island for roughly a decade, meaning Selkirk had marked it in his very first year of isolation. Here's the detail that lands hardest, and it's genuinely documented rather than embellished. Rats were as much a menace on Selkirk's island as they were aboard any ship, likely descendants of populations that had come ashore from earlier vessels over the preceding century, and they attacked him at night, gnawing at his feet and the exposed skin of his ears while he slept, badly enough that it became a serious, recurring problem. His solution, and this is where the ship's cat chapter from earlier tonight connects directly, was to tame some of the island's feral cats. likely also descended from shipboard cats set ashore or escaped over the decades. By feeding them scraps of goat meat until they trusted him enough to sleep curled around him at night, forming a living barrier the rats wouldn't cross. Later accounts describe him eventually surrounded by dozens of semi-tamed cats and goats living alongside his camp, an entire small ecosystem of formerly wild, formerly shipboard animals that had, in their own way, gone through almost exactly the same journey he had, set ashore, alone, forced to adapt or die. Consider the sheer scale of what 4 years of solitary goat hunting actually did to Selkirk physically, because the surviving accounts are specific enough on this point to be worth dwelling on rather than summarising in passing. Woodes Rogers' own published account of the rescue describes Selkirk as having become so conditioned by years of running down goats across the island's steep, difficult terrain that his fitness genuinely startled the rescue party, a man who could reportedly outpace trained sailors on ground that exhausted them within minutes. This wasn't incidental to his survival. It was, in a very real sense, the skill that made everything else possible, the same fitness and the same patient, practiced hunting technique that generations of Hispaniola buccaneers had developed out of necessity decades earlier, arrived at independently by one isolated man with nobody left to teach him anything at all. Here's where the goat's own history on the island matters as much as Selkirk's, because neither part of this story makes full sense without the other. The animals he depended on weren't native to Misitierra at all. They were descendants of goats deliberately released there by earlier Spanish and Portuguese sailors, likely as far back as the 16th century, following the exact same logic described earlier tonight regarding islands like Mona. Stock a remote, uninhabited landfall with a self-sustaining food source, for the benefit of whichever future sailor might need it, quite possibly a stranger from an entirely different nation and an entirely different generation. Selkirk, alone and desperate in 1704, was in the most literal sense living off a gift left by men who died decades before he was born, for a purpose that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with the general, shared understanding among sailors of that era that the sea eventually strands somebody, somewhere, and a stocked island might be the only thing standing between that stranger and starvation. Picture the specific practice of earmarking more closely, because Richard Steele's 1713 essay, drawn from his own direct interview with Selkirk after the rescue, describes it in enough detail to reconstruct clearly. Selkirk began the practice not out of scientific curiosity, but out of a very practical, very lonely impulse. Having killed enough goats purely for survival, he apparently reached a point where he wanted some way to know, when he encountered a goat again, whether it was one he'd already spared. The earmark, a simple slit or notch cut into the animal's ear, let him track individual goats across years of isolation in a landscape with no other way to keep such records. That one particular marked goat was recaptured roughly a decade after Selkirk's own marking of it, according to accounts drawn from later visitors to the island, means the practice outlived Selkirk's own presence there entirely, a strange, quiet monument to one man's 4 years of loneliness, still legible on a living animal long after the man himself had been rescued, gone home, and eventually died at sea off West Africa in 1721. There's a specific detail from Steele's account worth including here, for how directly it echoes the cat chapter from earlier tonight. Selkirk reportedly described the rat's attacks on his feet and ears as bad enough, in his first months alone, that he genuinely feared losing flesh to them while he slept. Unable to defend himself, unconscious the way he could while awake, the solution he arrived at, luring and taming the island's feral cats with scraps of goat meat until they trusted him enough to sleep curled around his body, wasn't a single deliberate stroke of genius so much as a slow trial and error process built entirely out of necessity. The same practical improvisation that let him build fire from friction after his gunpowder ran dry and fashion clothing from goat hide once his own sailor's garments finally wore through completely. Here's the detail that lands hardest of everything Steele recorded, and it deserves space of its own. By his account, Selkirk eventually kept company with dozens of semi-tamed cats and goats living around his camp, not pets in any sentimental modern sense, since his relationship with them remained fundamentally about survival throughout, but genuine, sustained companionship all the same, built over 4 years with no other option available to him. Selkirk reportedly told Steele that he'd grown so used to his animal company that upon rescue, reintegrating into ordinary human society took him considerable time and real discomfort, a detail that complicates any simple triumphant reading of his eventual return to civilization. He'd survived, genuinely and remarkably, but the survival had cost him something in his relationship to human company that 4 years of goats and cats couldn't entirely replace, even once real human voices were available to him again. Selkirk was finally rescued in February of 1709, spotted by a privateering expedition that happened to put in at the island, commanded, in one of history's smaller coincidences, by Woodes Rogers, whose own detailed published account of the rescue became the primary documented source for most of what's known about Selkirk's ordeal, supplemented by Steele's separate 1713 essay. By the time Rogers's men found him, Selkirk was reportedly so unaccustomed to speech after more than 4 years of near total isolation that witnesses described his words as difficult to understand at first, halting and strange in his own mouth. Here's the wrinkle worth being honest about, because the accuracy rules that govern tonight's whole journey apply here too. Selkirk's story is widely and reasonably credited as one of the direct inspirations for Daniel Defoe's 1719 novel Robinson Crusoe, though Defoe never explicitly confirmed the connection. And Crusoe's fictional island, fictional shipwreck, and fictional companion Friday diverge substantially from Selkirk's real, solitary, entirely self-reliant 4 years. Treat the Crusoe connection the way you'd treat any influence claim in literary history, probable, widely accepted by scholars, but not something Selkirk himself ever definitively confirmed before his death. What Selkirk's documented ordeal offers, more than almost any other account from this era, is the clearest possible demonstration of exactly how deeply human survival at sea and on the islands sailors used, abandoned, and returned to across generations depended on the animals already woven into that world by the sailors who came before. He didn't build a self-sufficient existence from nothing. He inherited it, unknowingly, from the goats a stranger released decades earlier and the cats that wandered off some other ship's deck long before his own troubles began. And he survived, in the most literal sense, by learning to live inside an animal economy other sailors had built without ever imagining who might need it next. Selkirk's animals weren't the whole of his survival, worth noting so the goats and cats don't crowd out the rest of a genuinely resourceful ordeal. Missa Tierra offered pimento trees, whose wood he used for both his huts and his fires, wild turnips and other vegetation left behind, according to some accounts, by earlier visiting ships in a pattern not unlike the goats themselves. Another quiet gift from strangers who'd passed through decades before, planted or seeded deliberately or accidentally, waiting for whoever needed it next. He fashioned needles from nails salvaged from his sea chest to repair clothing once his original garments finally gave out entirely, stitching new coverings from tanned goat hide using skills that echo, in miniature and in isolation, the same hide-working economy the Hispaniola buccaneers had built decades earlier on a much larger scale. It's worth holding both threads at once. Selkirk survived because of the animals this chapter has focused on, and he survived because 4 years alone gave him no choice but to become, in effect, his own one-man version of an entire hunting and provisioning economy that elsewhere in this story took dozens of men working together to sustain. Here's a detail that adds real tension to a story that can otherwise read. From this distance, as simply peaceful isolation, Selkirk wasn't only avoiding starvation during his 4 years alone. Spanish vessels, hostile to any English presence in these waters, given the ongoing state of war between the two crowns for much of this period, occasionally passed near or put in at the island and Selkirk, aware that capture by a Spanish crew could mean imprisonment or worse, reportedly hid from at least one landing party during his ordeal, according to later accounts drawn from his own retelling. Picture the specific awful calculation that moment demanded. A man who had spent months, by that point, desperate for any human contact at all, forced instead to stay silent and hidden while other human beings walked the same beach he'd been marooned on, because the particular humans in question flew the wrong flag. The goats that fed him and the cats that guarded his sleep couldn't help him with this part of the ordeal at all. This was purely human calculation, layered on top of an already extraordinary physical survival story. And it's easy to lose sight of, amid all the goat hunting detail, how much psychological strain that kind of enforced, self-imposed hiding must have added to an already isolated existence. There's a longer legacy worth including here too, because Selkirk's animals didn't simply vanish from the historical record once Woodes Rogers's ship sailed away with him aboard. The feral goat population he'd hunted, marked and depended on for 4 years continued on Miss Artiera for generations afterward. Well documented enough that later naturalists and visitors to the renamed Robinson Crusoe Island, the island was formally renamed in the 20th century specifically to capitalise on the Selkirk-Crusoe connection, continued encountering goats descended from the same stock into the modern era, alongside the descendants of the cats Selkirk had tamed. In a strange way, the ecosystem Selkirk lived inside for 4 years outlived not just his own presence on the island, but very nearly outlived the age of sail itself that had originally stocked it. A living, breathing continuity stretching from 16th century Spanish provisioning voyages through one 18th century castaway's ordeal, and on into an era of tourism and conservation science that none of the sailors who first released those goats could possibly have imagined. It's one of the clearest available illustrations across this entire knight's journey of just how long an animal introduced for one narrow practical purpose can keep shaping a place and the people who pass through it, decades and centuries after the original reason for its presence there, has been entirely forgotten by everyone except the animals themselves. Selkirk's story is famous partly because it ended in rescue, and partly because it happened to inspire a novel. But marooning itself, putting a man ashore deliberately, whether as punishment, as the resolution to an unbearable dispute, or, as in Selkirk's case, at the man's own furious insistence, was a documented, if not especially common practice across the broader piratical and privateering world of this era, and the outcome for most marooned sailors was never recorded at all, because most of them simply died on whatever stretch of coast or island they'd been left on, unwitnessed and unremembered. Selkirk survived specifically because Miss Artiera happened to be one of the small number of islands along the sailing routes of the era that earlier generations of sailors had deliberately stocked with exactly the resources a stranded man would need. Goats, in this case, and incidentally cats, and because he possessed, or developed under pressure, the specific hunting skill this whole knight's earlier chapters have traced back to the Hispaniola buccaneers. Change either variable, an unstocked island, or a less capable man. And this becomes one more anonymous tragedy rather than one of the best documented survival stories the Age of Sail ever produced. William Dampier, the expedition's overall commander, deserves a moment of his own here, because his presence connects Selkirk's story to a broader pattern this whole night has touched on more than once: the blurry, permeable line between piracy, privateering, and legitimate scientific exploration during this period. Dampier had, by the time of Selkirk's marooning, already circumnavigated the globe multiple times, published detailed natural history observations that later influenced serious scientists, including Alexander von Humboldt and, by some accounts, Charles Darwin himself, and moved between outright piracy, government-sanctioned privateering, and Royal Navy service across a career that resists any tidy single label. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of figure this entire script has been circling around from its very first chapter, someone whose relationship with animals, exploration, and outright plunder braided together in ways the neat modern categories of scientist and pirate don't easily accommodate. Selkirk served under a captain answering, at least nominally, to Dampier's overall command, and the same expedition that stranded Selkirk on Misetiera was, at the very same time, generating genuinely valuable natural history observations about the Pacific world it was nominally there to raid. The distinction between privateer and pirate mattered enormously to the men living it, even if it looks academic from 3 centuries' distance. A privateer operated under a government commission, a letter of marque, that made attacking enemy shipping legal rather than a hanging offence, provided the privateer stayed within the commission's terms and didn't stray into attacking neutral or allied vessels. Selkirk's own voyage under straddling was, technically, entirely legal by the standards of the war then running between England and Spain, which makes the islands stocked with feral goats that saved his life doubly ironic, since those goats had been deliberately planted by Spanish and Portuguese sailors generations earlier, meant to feed exactly the kind of stranded sailor Selkirk turned out to be, regardless of which flag that sailor eventually served under. The animals themselves, in other words, never cared about the legal category their eventual beneficiary fell into. They simply waited, generation after generation, for whoever showed up hungry enough to need them. It's worth remembering, too, that Selkirk's own status shifted the moment he chose marooning over continuing the voyage. He left as a sailing master under commission, technically still a legitimate privateer's officer, and spent the following 4 years as neither privateer nor pirate nor ordinary castaway in any conventional sense. Simply a man stripped of every legal category that had previously defined him, left with nothing but an island's inherited animal economy and his own considerable will to survive it. Not every animal aboard was inherited, tamed, or eaten on purpose, though. Some of them simply arrived, uninvited, unstoppable, and considerably more numerous than anyone aboard would have liked. Your name, tonight, is Ezra Coombs, and you are, by trade, and by the ship's articles both, the carpenter, which means the rats are, unofficially, also your problem, because a rat that gnaws through a hull, seen badly enough, is a leak, and a leak is very much a carpenter's business. You wake to the sound of scratching, which by this point in the voyage you've stopped consciously registering. The way a landsman stops hearing traffic outside a window he's lived beside for years. Somewhere behind the ballast, in the dark, wet space at the very bottom of the hull, the ship's rat population is going about its own business, entirely indifferent to yours. Here's the honest scale of the problem, documented across countless ship's logs and provisioning records from the entire age of sail. A wooden vessel provided rats with nearly ideal conditions, abundant food in the form of stored grain and biscuit, warmth, protection from most predators beyond the ship's cat, and dense, safe nesting material in coiled rope and packed cargo. Populations could and did explode across a long voyage, to the point that some recorded losses of stored food to rat damage ran into a genuinely significant fraction of a ship's entire provisions by the time landfall came. You start the morning, as you start most mornings, checking the biscuit barrels, and the news is bad in the specific, familiar way it's been bad for weeks. Weevils, again, the small dark beetles whose larvae work their way through ship's biscuit reliably enough that weevilly bread barely counted as a complaint by this stage of a long voyage. More a simple description of what breakfast was. The trick, which every hand aboard learns within their first few months at sea, whether anyone officially teaches it or not, is to tap the biscuit sharply against the table edge before eating, knocking loose whatever's managed to burrow in, and then simply not looking too closely at what falls out. Sailors across the entire era developed a dark, practical humour about this rather than genuine horror. Protein is protein, someone always says, and someone always laughs. Because laughing is easier than the alternative on week 7 of a long crossing. Here's the part that's harder to laugh about. Cockroaches, present in numbers that make the weevils look almost tasteful by comparison, infested nearly every warm, food-adjacent space below decks, and surviving accounts from across the age of sail describe them as bold enough, in sufficiently large infestations, to bite sleeping sailors on exposed skin, fingernails and calloused feet mostly, though the historical record includes accounts of worse. You've developed the habit, like most of the crew, of sleeping with your hands tucked well inside your hammock rather than dangling free. A small, learned defence against a problem nobody aboard has any real solution for beyond tolerance and habit. By your 3rd week at sea this voyage, lice have become the genuinely universal problem, not confined to any one man's berth or habits, but spreading crew-wide through close quarters, shared hammocks, and the simple impossibility of proper washing aboard a vessel where fresh water is rationed too tightly to spare on bathing. You spend a portion of most evenings doing what every other hand aboard is doing in the same low light, picking through your own hair and clothing seams by feel and lamplight. A task so universal across the age of sail that it barely registers as remarkable in surviving accounts, mentioned almost in passing, the way a modern account might mention brushing teeth. Here's where Ezra's story connects back to everything you've already heard tonight. Because the ship's cat, the same animal treated with something close to reverence a few chapters back, earns every bit of that reverence specifically because of nights like this one. You watch her, unnamed by ship's convention, but recognised by every hand aboard, work the space behind the ballast for a solid hour past midnight, and by morning the scratching that greeted you at dawn has gone noticeably quieter. It won't stay that way. It never does, not entirely, not on a vessel this old and this thoroughly infested, but quieter counts for something. On a ship where the alternative is losing a meaningful fraction of the food supply to teeth smaller than your smallest finger. Consider the specific arithmetic of a ship's biscuit ration more closely, because it clarifies exactly how much of a genuine threat weevil damage actually posed, rather than treating it as mere unpleasant seasoning. Ship's biscuit, or hardtack, was baked deliberately hard and dry, precisely to resist spoilage over long voyages, and under reasonable storage conditions could theoretically last for months or even years. Weevil infestation undermined that entire calculation because larvae boring through the biscuit created channels that let moisture in, which in turn invited mould and further spoilage well beyond what the weevils themselves consumed directly. A barrel that looked, on cursory inspection, only lightly affected could, within weeks, deteriorate into something genuinely unfit to eat, which is exactly why Ezra and every carpenter and quartermaster like him took biscuit barrel inspection as seriously as they took checking the hull itself for rot. Both, in their own way, were structural integrity checks on the thing keeping the whole voyage alive. Picture the specific, unglamorous work of actual pest management aboard a wooden ship, because it went well beyond simply tolerating the problem and involved active, if imperfect, countermeasures, Some crews across the broader age of sail experimented with sealing food stores in ways designed to slow rat and insect access, heavier barrels, tighter lids. Occasionally metal fittings where cost allowed, though metal was expensive enough aboard a working pirate vessel that this remained more common on well-funded naval vessels than on the leaner ships most pirate crews actually sailed. Ezra spends a genuine afternoon, this particular voyage, reinforcing the lid seals on the ship's remaining flour barrels with strips of scavenged canvas and tar, a fix that buys weeks rather than solving the problem permanently, because nothing aboard a wooden ship at sea ever solved a pest problem permanently. The best any crew could realistically do was slow the losses and stay ahead of total spoilage until the next landfall offered a chance to resupply. Here's a detail that complicates the vermin as pure misery framing this chapter has otherwise leaned on, because period accounts occasionally describe sailors developing an oddly practical, even affectionate relationship with specific insects and small creatures aboard, in the absence of almost anything else to occupy idle hours during a long, monotonous crossing. Ezra himself, you notice partway through this voyage, has taken to watching a particular large cockroach that's made a home in a crack near his workbench, tracking its movements with something close to idle curiosity rather than pure disgust. The same way a bored man might watch a spider work a web in the corner of a room back home. He doesn't kill it. When you ask him why, he just shrugs and says it's not hurting anything he cares about, and there's precious little else aboard worth watching that isn't also work. By your 5th week aboard, the lice problem has genuinely worsened rather than stabilised, and the crew's collective response tells you something about how thoroughly ordinary this misery had become across the entire era. Rather than treating it as a crisis, the men have developed something close to a shared, low-grade ritual around it. Evenings spent picking through hair and seams by lamplight, occasionally trading rough jokes about who's worst afflicted. The kind of dark communal humour that turns a genuinely unpleasant shared condition into something almost bearable through sheer repetition and company. You realise, watching this unfold night after night, that this ritual functions a little like the Sunday routines described in accounts of shore-bound working communities of the same era, a small, deliberately marked moment of shared attention amid an otherwise undifferentiated stretch of hard labour. Valuable less for what it accomplishes practically, and more for the fact that it's done together. 6 weeks out, and the carpenter's real nightmare arrives. Not rats in the food, which is manageable, expected, priced into every voyage's planning, but rats in the structure itself. You find a seam near the bow gnawed wide enough to worry you, wood fibres stripped back in a pattern too regular to be simple wear, and you spend the better part of a day repairing damage that, left unaddressed, could have widened into a genuine leak weeks from now, in weather considerably worse than today's calm. This is documented, real, and unglamorous in exactly the way most of tonight's journey has been, a threat to the ship's actual seaworthiness, caused not by cannon fire or storm, but by an animal roughly the size of your fist, working alone, in the dark, with nothing but patience and a set of teeth built for exactly this purpose. 6 weeks out, and you finally understand something about Ezra's earlier worry regarding that seam near the bow, because a second, smaller breach turns up near the stern, and this time the ship's carpenter's mate, a younger hand still learning the trade under Ezra's supervision, misses it during his own inspection round, catching it only because Ezra double-checks his work out of habit rather than suspicion. The near miss unsettles Ezra more than he lets on, and he spends an extra hour that evening walking the entire lower hull by lamplight, checking seams that were checked only days before, because on a wooden ship 3,000 miles from the nearest dry dock, the margin between an annoying rat problem and a genuinely dangerous leak is measured in inches of gnawed timber, and nobody aboard wants to discover that margin has run out in the middle of open water. Here's the strange comfort buried in all of it, if you look for it. Every hand aboard, from the captain down to the powder monkey, lives with the same vermin, suffers the same bites, taps the same weevils out of the same biscuit before eating. It's one of the very few genuine equalizers aboard a ship where the articles already promise something close to equal shares, an equal say, a shared, universal, entirely undignified misery that nobody aboard is exempt from, officer or forecastle hand alike. There's something almost democratic about a louse. By the time this voyage ends, you've killed more rats with your own hands, by simple opportunistic swatting, than you've killed men. A detail that would surprise most people back home who imagine piracy as constant violence. When in truth, for most crews on most voyages, the daily war was fought against smaller, hungrier, more persistent enemies than any Spanish guardacosta ever posed. You step ashore at journey's end, scratching absently at your collar, already half certain you're bringing lice home with you. And you're right, and somehow, after everything, that's almost funny. The vermin never got voted a share, never earned a name, never received the wary respect the goats and cats did. They were simply the cost of the ship being made of wood, floating on salt water, carrying men who needed to eat, a cost paid every single day of every single voyage, quietly, itchily, and almost entirely unmentioned in the songs written about this era afterward. And yet they shaped the voyage all the same, in every plank Ezra checked, every biscuit tapped clean before eating, every quiet hour spent picking lice by lamplight alongside men who understood, without needing to say so aloud, that this particular misery, at least, belonged to everyone equally. Here's the biological reality underlying everything this chapter has described, worth spelling out plainly because it explains why the problem never actually went away, no matter how hard any single cat or carpenter worked at it. A female rat can begin breeding within a matter of weeks of her own birth, and a single pair, given the abundant food and shelter a ship's hold provided, could theoretically produce enough offspring across a single long voyage to overwhelm almost any reasonable containment effort, a mathematical reality period sailors understood intuitively through direct, repeated experience, even without any formal knowledge of reproductive biology behind it. This is precisely why a single working ship's cat, however skilled, was fighting a battle it could realistically only manage rather than ever fully win. One effective hunter killing rats one at a time, against a population capable of replacing its own losses faster than almost any predator could keep pace with. You start to understand, watching Ezra's grim, methodical daily inspections, that the entire shipboard approach to vermin wasn't really about victory in any final sense. It was about slowing an unwinnable numbers game down to a pace the voyage could survive, buying weeks and months rather than achieving anything like actual eradication. The same unglamorous, incremental logic that governed almost every other resource this whole night's journey has covered. Consider, too, a specific and genuinely documented consequence of exactly this kind of infestation, because it moves the vermin problem from mere unpleasantness into something with real, sometimes fatal stakes. Ships across the broader age of sail occasionally experienced outbreaks of illness that later medical understanding would trace to conditions rat infestations created or worsened, contaminated food and water stores, flea populations carried on rat hosts, general filth in spaces too cramped and poorly ventilated to maintain by any modern standard of hygiene. Period sailors and ship's surgeons couldn't name the precise mechanism the way modern medicine eventually would, but they observed the correlation plainly enough in their own rough way. A ship with a bad rat problem was, more often than not, a ship that also struggled with sickness among its crew, and captains and quartermasters who took vermin control seriously weren't only protecting their food supply, whether they fully understood it or not. You think about this, lying in your hammock one particularly bad night listening to the scratching behind the ballast, and it adds a weight to Ezra's daily, thankless inspections that goes beyond simple property maintenance. Every seam he checks, every barrel he reinforces, is also, in its own indirect way, a small act of protecting the health of every man aboard, whether anyone ever thanks him for it or not. You watch the crew try a handful of actual countermeasures beyond simply relying on the cat. This voyage, with mixed and generally disappointing results. Someone suggests smoking out a particularly bad nest behind the ballast, burning a smouldering rag in the enclosed space to try to drive the rats out where they could be killed or at least counted. And it works, briefly, for exactly one section of the hold, before the survivors simply relocate a few frames further along and resume business within the week. Poison of any reliable, purpose-built kind was largely unavailable to a working pirate crew of this era. Arsenic existed and was understood to be lethal. But using it aboard a ship where food stores, fresh water, and rat nests all occupied the same cramped, poorly separated spaces risked poisoning the crew's own provisions as readily as the rats. A trade no quartermaster in his right mind would accept. A few hands try the crude, direct approach instead, traps improvised from scrap wood and cord, more patience than craft in the construction, and catch, over the course of a full week's effort, perhaps a dozen rats total, a number that barely registers against a population replacing itself faster than any trap could account for. By the end of the voyage, the general consensus among the crew, stated with the same weary resignation that governs most of shipboard life, is that the cat remains, for all its limitations, still the single most effective tool anyone aboard actually has. There's a strange adjustment waiting on the other end of a long voyage too, worth including because it says something true about how thoroughly this misery reshapes a man's expectations without his quite noticing. You step ashore at journey's end and spend the first several nights in a rented room above a tavern, unable to fully relax. Some part of you still listening for scratching that isn't there, still instinctively tucking your hands inside whatever blanket you're using, the way you'd learned to protect them from cockroach bites below decks. It passes, eventually, the way most things learned under duress eventually fade once the duress itself is gone. But for those first few nights, lying in a bed that doesn't move, in a room with walls that aren't being quietly, patiently gnawed at by anything, the absence itself feels almost unfamiliar, a kind of silence you'd stopped expecting to ever hear again, months before you actually got to. You mention this to Bartholomew once, in passing, and he just nods, unsurprised, and tells you it happens to every man who's spent long enough at sea, and that it's one more thing, alongside the coin in your pocket and the salt still crusted in your boots, that the voyage leaves with you whether you asked for it or not. Here's a detail worth including about why some ships suffered far worse than others, because the infestation problem was never evenly distributed across the entire pirate fleet. An older vessel, its timbers already softened by years of salt water and repeated repair, offered rats and cockroaches considerably more hiding space and easier access than a newer hull would, which is part of why captured prize ships, often better maintained than the aging sloops many pirate crews started out with, were prized for more than just their cargo or their guns. A tighter, sounder hull meant fewer gaps for vermin to exploit in the first place, a genuinely practical consideration layered on top of all the other reasons a crew might vote to abandon their old vessel entirely in favour of a fresh prize. You notice this yourself, comparing notes with a hand who'd served on the ship before this one, a considerably older vessel he describes as having been, in his words, more roach than wood by the time her crew finally traded her away. cockroach species most commonly plaguing ships of this era, incidentally, weren't native to the Caribbean at all. They'd arrived generations earlier aboard European vessels, hitchhikers on the same trade routes that carried everything else across the Atlantic, established so thoroughly by the Golden Age that nobody aboard any ship of this period would have known a world without them. That's a strange thought to sit with, turning it over during a quiet watch. The roaches biting your ankles tonight trace their own lineage back across the ocean just as surely as any of the human crew's families once did. Unwilling passengers on the very same crossing that built this whole world you're currently sailing through. Not every animal that crossed a pirate ship's deck arrived by trade, by inheritance, or by uninvited infestation, though. Some of them arrived at the point of a cutlass, taken the same way everything else aboard a prize ship got taken. Which brings tonight's journey to a raid that actually happened, against a target chosen, in no small part, for exactly the kind of animal it promised to deliver. In the summer of 1668, the Welsh-born privateer turned pirate Henry Morgan led a substantial force of buccaneers against the Spanish port of Puerto del Príncipe, on Cuba, a raid remembered today mostly for its ransom demands and the brutal treatment of captured townspeople. Details well documented enough across multiple corroborating Spanish and English sources to be treated as solid history, rather than Johnson-style embellishment. What's less often mentioned, but equally well attested, is that livestock was a deliberate, explicit target of the raid from the outset, not incidental plunder scooped up alongside the coin and church silver, but a primary objective because Morgan's force, like nearly every buccaneer expedition of the period, faced the same relentless provisioning problem that had driven the Hispaniola hunters to the Bocan fires decades earlier. An army on the march, even a small, loosely organised one, eats constantly, and Cuba's interior held exactly the kind of substantial cattle herds descended from the same Spanish colonial introductions that had stocked Hispaniola that could feed a raiding force for weeks. This is the story of Puerto del Príncipe, then, not primarily a legend of gold, though gold changed hands, but a raid that ran at a structural level on cattle. Picture the mechanics of it as reconstructed from the surviving accounts. Morgan's force landed and marched inland rather than attacking the port directly by sea, specifically to avoid Spanish coastal defences, a tactical choice that also happened to route the buccaneers directly through cattle country, and surviving accounts describe the force living substantially off captured livestock during the approach march itself, well before the town's actual treasury was ever touched. By the time the town fell, the raiders had already been eating Spanish cattle for days, in a pattern that repeats across nearly every documented buccaneer land campaign of the era. Seize the food first, because a starving raiding party is a raiding party that falls apart before it ever reaches its objective. Here's where the story earns its place specifically, in a chapter about animals rather than a general account of the raid. Once the town itself was secured, Morgan's force spent considerable time, accounts suggest days, not hours, specifically rounding up and slaughtering the substantial cattle herds in the surrounding countryside, both for immediate consumption by the raiding force and, crucially, for salting and preserving meat to carry back to the ships for the return voyage and the next expedition after that. This wasn't opportunistic looting. It was organised, deliberate provisioning on a scale that required real coordination, driving herds, controlling slaughter, managing the salt and smoke needed to preserve meat in tropical heat, without it spoiling before it reached the coast. Work that drew directly on exactly the Bocan fire skills the earlier generation of Hispaniola hunters had developed and passed down. Consider the economics of it from Morgan's perspective, because it clarifies something the earlier chapters have been building toward all night. Coin and silver were valuable, certainly, and got divided among the crew according to the ship's articles, same as always. But coin doesn't feed 150 hungry men on the voyage home. and a raiding force that returns to its ships with treasure but no food faces a genuinely dangerous crossing, regardless of how rich they've technically become. Livestock, converted through slaughter and salt into portable, preservable meat, was in a very real sense the more immediately valuable prize of the two, even though it's the coin that survives in popular memory. Here's a detail worth sitting with, because it's one of the genuinely harder parts of this history to present honestly. The raid on Puerto del Principe, like most buccaneer land campaigns of the period, involved real, documented cruelty toward the town's inhabitants, hostage-taking, coercive interrogation, and conditions that by any modern standard constitute serious atrocity. All of it aimed at extracting information about where wealth and livestock had been hidden or driven off before the raiders arrived. It would be dishonest to tell this story as though the animal provisioning angle exists in some separate, gentler category from the raid's broader violence. The cattle Morgan's men captured were taken, in the most literal sense, by force. From people who depended on those same animals for their own survival, the same feral goat, standing food reserve logic that fed Alexander Selkirk decades later, except here it's not abandoned wildlife being harvested, it's a working colonial economy being stripped of its livelihood at gunpoint. That tension, provisioning as both practical necessity and genuine harm inflicted on ordinary people, runs through nearly every animal-related episode this entire script has covered tonight, if you look closely enough. The goats on Josiah's ship, cheap and plentiful because generations of sailors had stocked islands with exactly this eventuality in mind, existed within a colonial system that had itself displaced entire ecosystems and, more consequentially, entire populations of people to make room for European livestock in the first place. The exotic parrots and monkeys traded for profit were taken from environments and, in the broadest sense, from ecosystems that had no say in the matter. None of tonight's animal stories exist in a vacuum, separate from the larger, harder history of colonization and violence that piracy operated within, and, in the case of raids like Puerto del Principe, actively participated in. By the time Morgan's force withdrew back toward the coast, carrying preserved meat, captured coin, and, according to the surviving accounts, a certain amount of livestock driven along live rather than slaughtered, presumably to restock the ship's own pens for the voyage onward. The raid had accomplished exactly what it set out to accomplish. On both fronts, provisioning and plunder together, inseparable from each other in practice, even though history tends to remember only the treasure half of the ledger. Consider the specific mechanics of the cattle drive itself more closely, because moving a substantial herd overland toward a coast, under armed guard, through terrain the raiders didn't know intimately, was a genuinely demanding logistical operation in its own right, one that required men experienced specifically in handling livestock at scale, not merely men skilled at fighting. This is precisely where the buccaneer hunter background of so many of Morgan's raiders paid off in ways separate from combat entirely. Men who'd spent years running down wild cattle on Hispaniola, reading herd behavior, understanding how to move large animals without scattering them into unmanageable panic, brought exactly the skill set this phase of the campaign demanded. Decades of hard, unglamorous hunting experience repurposed directly into a raid's supply chain. Picture 2, the specific vulnerability a livestock-laden raiding column represented on the return march, because it's a detail the more romanticized retellings of Morgan's career tend to skip past entirely. A column moving slowly, encumbered by driven cattle and men carrying preserved meat, was considerably easier for Spanish colonial forces to locate and potentially intercept than a lightly equipped raiding party moving fast. Surviving accounts of Morgan's campaigns describe real anxiety among the raiders during exactly this kind of return march, aware that the very provisioning success that would keep them fed on the voyage home also made them a slower, more exposed target for exactly as long as the march lasted. The livestock that fed the raiders was, simultaneously, the thing most likely to get some of them killed before they ever reached the ships waiting on the coast. There's a broader economic pattern worth drawing out here. Because Puerto del Principe wasn't an isolated case, it fits a documented pattern repeating across nearly every major buccaneer land campaign of the period, including Morgan's later, larger raids on Portobello and eventually Panama itself in 1671. Each of these campaigns, to varying documented degrees, involved deliberate livestock seizure as part of the operation's basic provisioning strategy, not as incidental plunder. The pattern held consistently enough that it's reasonable to treat livestock seizure as a standard, expected element of Caribbean buccaneer land warfare generally throughout this period, on the same footing as seizing coin, arms, or hostages for ransom. Here's a detail worth sitting with for how it complicates the raid's aftermath specifically. Colonial correspondence and later Spanish accounts from the region describe the economic damage inflicted on communities like Puerto del Principe as extending well beyond whatever coin or silver got carried off. Livestock losses on this scale represented a genuine, lasting blow to a colonial settlement's own food security and economic base, the kind of damage that could take years to recover from even after the raiders themselves were long gone. This is the harder, less comfortable half of the animal provisioning story running underneath tonight's entire journey. Every time a pirate or buccaneer crew solved its own hunger through captured livestock, somewhere on the other end of that transaction, a settlement, a farm, or a family absorbed a loss that the historical songs celebrating Morgan's exploits never much bothered to mention. There's one more thread worth pulling before this chapter closes, because it circles back, unexpectedly, to the parrot and monkey trade from earlier tonight. Beyond Morgan's specific campaigns, the broader documented record of buccaneer and pirate raids across the Caribbean and, later, along the routes toward Madagascar and the Indian Ocean, includes references to exotic animals seized alongside more conventional plunder. Birds, small mammals, occasionally more unusual creatures, taken from captured ships or raided settlements and either sold along established trading networks or, in a smaller number of documented cases, given as gifts between pirate crews and the local rulers and traders they depended on for safe harbour, fresh water, and provisions in return. This gift-giving pattern is genuinely documented in accounts of pirate activity around Madagascar in particular during the later Golden Age, where sustained, semi-permanent relationships between pirate crews and local Malagasy communities depended on exactly this kind of ongoing exchange. Plunder and exotic goods flowing one direction, safe harbour, food and information flowing the other. Treat the more elaborate versions of this, organised pirate settlements running their own diplomatic exchanges, complete with formal gift protocols, with the same caution due any account touching on the semi-legendary pirate republic traditions associated with Madagascar during this period, since the surviving documentation is considerably thinner and more disputed than the Puerto del Principe raid itself. What's solid is the underlying pattern. Animals, exotic and mundane both, functioned as currency, as provisioning, and occasionally as genuine diplomatic tender, in an economy that had almost nothing to do with the treasure chest imagery that eventually came to define how the whole era gets remembered. By the time Morgan's own career wound down, he eventually received a knighthood and a colonial governorship from the English crown, one of history's stranger full circle turns for a man who spent years as a buccaneer raiding Spanish territory before becoming, in effect, an official administrator of English Caribbean interests himself. The pattern he'd relied on throughout his raiding career had already been repeated by countless other crews across the region, each one drawing on the same basic playbook the Hispaniola hunters had worked out with wild cattle decades earlier. Take what the land offers, share it out among the men who took the risk to get it, and worry about tomorrow's food only once today's is secured. By the time Puerto del Principe's raiders reached their ships again, the animals that made the whole campaign survivable, the cattle driven along live, the meat salted and stowed below, had already done their essential, unglamorous work, the same work goats and pigs and chickens had been doing on every pirate voyage this whole night has covered. From Josiah Dunn's floating farm through to this final, harder chapter. Coin bought reputation. Livestock, every single time, bought the ability to make it home at all. Alexandra Exquemelin, the same barber surgeon whose 1678 account gave this whole night's journey its clearest window into the Hispaniola hunting economy, didn't stop chronicling buccaneer life once the hunters moved from Hispaniola's interior onto the water. He sailed with buccaneer forces himself during this general period, and later wrote directly about Henry Morgan's major campaigns, including the massive 1671 assault on Panama that represents, by most historical accounts, the single largest and most consequential buccaneer operation of the entire era. Exquemelin's account of these campaigns, while subject to the same general caution any single period source deserves, he had his own biases, his own scores to settle with Morgan by the time he wrote it all down, nonetheless provides something Charles Johnson's later, more removed account never could. The perspective of a man who had personally lived the hunting economy this whole script has traced from its origins, watching that same economy scale up into full-blown military campaigns against entire Spanish colonial cities. The livestock provisioning pattern described earlier tonight in relation to Puerto del Principe repeats. According to Exquemelin's own account, across Morgan's later and larger campaigns as well, cattle seized and driven along raiding columns from Portobello through to the final, brutal march on Panama itself. The same unglamorous arithmetic of feeding an army on the move playing out again and again at increasing scale, right up to the largest single land campaign the Golden Age of Piracy would ever produce. Consider, too, the practical logistics of what happened once a raid's plunder, livestock included, actually reached the coast and needed dividing among a raiding force that, in Morgan's case, spanned multiple ships and well over 1,000 men drawn from several different crews operating under a loose joint command. A genuinely complicated administrative problem that the popular image of pirates as chaotic and ungoverned tends to obscure entirely. Livestock, driven along live, needed distributing across several vessels' holds before the return voyage could even begin. A physical, logistical challenge in its own right, requiring boats to ferry animals out to ships at anchor, pens to be built or repaired aboard multiple vessels simultaneously, and careful coordination between quartermasters representing different crews who each answered to their own separate articles and their own separate votes. This wasn't invented on the spot. Buccaneer forces operating at this scale had, by Morgan's era, developed reasonably standardized practices for exactly this kind of multi-crew division of plunder, livestock and coin alike, precisely because disputes over an unfair division could and did tear a joint operation apart from within, sometimes more dangerously than any Spanish counterattack could. The equal shares ethos this whole night has traced back to individual ships' articles scaled up, however imperfectly, to govern relationships between entire crews operating together, evidence that the underlying logic of shared risk and negotiated reward wasn't simply a feature of small ship life, but something buccaneer society had worked out how to apply at genuinely large scale. Picture the specific exhaustion of the return march itself, because surviving accounts describe conditions considerably harder than the initial advance into Spanish territory had been. Cattle driven overland for days, already stressed by unfamiliar handling and the noise and chaos of a raid, moved slower than fighting men alone would have, and the tropical heat took a genuine toll on animals unaccustomed to being pushed this hard this fast. Some portion of any driven herd, according to the general pattern described in period accounts of buccaneer land campaigns, simply didn't survive the return march at all, collapsing from exhaustion or injury before ever reaching the coast. Meat lost to spoilage and heat that gave a raiding party no real means of preserving a carcass properly mid-march. This is the harder, more honest arithmetic sitting underneath the whole triumphant framing of a successful raid. Not every animal seized made it to a ship's hold. Not every pound of captured meat made it home, and the raiders themselves. Exhausted and increasingly anxious about Spanish pursuit, the longer the column took to reach the coast, had to make hard, fast decisions about which animals to keep driving and which to simply slaughter and salt on the spot rather than risk losing entirely. It's a messier, more improvised process than the clean narrative of a successful raid usually allows for, and it's worth remembering that the men making these calls were doing so under real pressure, with real consequences for getting the arithmetic wrong. There's a final thread worth pulling here, because it connects Morgan's raid directly back to the very first chapter of tonight's journey, aboard Josiah Dunn's floating farm months and worlds away from Cuba's cattle country. Every animal covered tonight, from a goat named Nan to a green turtle flipped patiently on its back to Selkirk's marked and half-tamed goats on a lonely Pacific island, to the cattle herds Morgan's raiders drove toward the coast at gunpoint, existed within the same basic, unglamorous logic. Food doesn't sail itself across an ocean, doesn't survive a campaign on its own, doesn't keep 100 or 1,000 men upright and fighting fit without deliberate, constant, unsentimental management by people who understood exactly what was at stake if they got the arithmetic wrong. Piracy's reputation ran on gold and violence and the black flag snapping in the wind. Its actual survival, voyage after voyage, campaign after campaign, ran on considerably less glamorous creatures, hooved, feathered, shelled, and occasionally infested, doing the quiet, essential work the songs never got around to mentioning. Here's a final strategic detail worth including, because it shows the provisioning problem shaping pirate decision-making at the highest level, not just the day-to-day grind this whole night has otherwise focused on. Colonial towns across the Spanish Caribbean, having endured repeated raids exactly like the one on Puerto del Príncipe, gradually developed their own countermeasures specifically aimed at denying raiders easy access to livestock, driving herds inland at the first warning of an approaching force. Hiding cattle in terrain raiders were less likely to search thoroughly, sometimes even deliberately scattering or slaughtering their own herds rather than let them fall into buccaneer hands intact. This countermeasure, documented in Spanish colonial correspondence from the period, meant that by the later decades of the Golden Age, a raiding party could no longer assume the kind of easy, abundant provisioning Morgan's men had found at Puerto del Príncipe in 1668. Later captains had to factor this hardening resistance directly into their planning, sometimes choosing targets specifically based on how likely a given settlement was to still have accessible livestock, rather than purely on how much coin or silver a target promised. The animals, in other words, shaped the map of piracy itself, quietly influencing which towns got raided and which got left alone, in a strategic calculation that never once made it into any of the songs written about this era, but that mattered every bit as much to the men actually planning these campaigns as any question of treasure ever did. And that, in the end, is the animal you never hear about in the songs. The one that didn't fight, didn't loot, didn't fly any flag, and kept an entire violent, glamorized, thoroughly mythologized era of history alive anyway. One hoofprint and one careful ledger entry at a time. You've spent tonight aboard a ship that was never as simple as the flag on its mast suggested, a floating farm and a floating menagerie both, carrying goats that earned names nobody meant to give them, a cat that outworked half the crew and answered to nobody's articles but its own instincts, a parrot that owes most of its fame to a novelist born a century after the real trade in exotic birds had already ended, and a castaway on a lonely Pacific island who survived 4 years by learning to live inside an animal economy other sailors had quietly built for him, decades before he ever needed it. Somewhere back at the very start of tonight's journey, there was a goat named Nan, traded off for 2 barrels of flour on a morning nobody warned Josiah about. There was a cat, unnamed, working the dark space behind the ballast while a whole ship slept, trusting her to keep the worst of it at bay. There was Alexander Selkirk, alone on Misitiera, marking a goat's ear in his very first desperate year, not yet knowing that same mark would still be readable a decade later, proof that something out there had kept living, kept surviving, the whole time he had to. None of it was glamorous. Most of it smelled terrible. All of it, in its quiet, unrecorded way, mattered more to whether these men made it home than any cutlass or cannon ever did. You're warm right now, in your own bed, in whatever corner of the world you've settled into for the night. There's no manger below your floor, no weevils in whatever's waiting in your kitchen tomorrow, no rats testing the seams of the walls around you while you sleep. That gap between where you are and where this story just spent 3 centuries is worth noticing, gently, before you let it go. You're warm. You're dry. Whatever's keeping you fed tonight isn't standing in a pen down the hall, waiting its turn. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.